England's royal history is a grand tapestry, gilded, embroidered, and blood-stained. Behind every crown lies a ledger of secrets. Heirs who vanished, queens imprisoned without trial, kings who ruled from padded rooms. This isn't the version taught in schools. This is the version whispered in locked rooms, buried in footnotes, and politely ignored in coronation broadcasts. For every statue you've seen, there's a shadow it refuses to cast. So tonight, we're flipping the portrait. These are 53 dark, uncomfortable, and very real royal facts that history teachers didn't dare mention. Welcome to the other side of the throne. Before we dive headfirst into royal cover-ups and crown-sanctioned chaos, make sure you're subscribed, because trust me, this rabbit hole only gets deeper. And while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country and the time right now in the comments. Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Manila? I want to know who else is wide awake, listening to royal skeletons rattle in the dark. 1. Blinded to remove a rival. In 1036, the Kingdom of England sat in the uneasy quiet between two dynasties, its spine still aching from the collapse of Canut's Scandinavian Empire. But beneath that silence, bloodlines twisted like a knife. Enter Alfred Atheling, the younger son of Athelred the Unready, and by blood, a prince with a theoretical claim to the throne. He returned to England from exile with the hopeful naivety of a man thinking lineage is enough to protect him. It wasn't. Harold Harefoot, Canut's illegitimate son, was vying for control in the power vacuum after his father's death. He was not one for ambiguity. Alfred was intercepted by Harold's allies in Kent. What followed was not a battle, not a trial, not even a confrontation, just a quiet disappearance into custody, and then, not long after, a body, blinded, maimed, dead. The chronicles, in their restrained medieval phrasing, suggest Alfred was taken and blinded and died soon after. But even 1,000 years later, the political message is hard to miss. This wasn't an accident. This was an erasure. The kind of erasure that doesn't just remove a rival, it silences a future. Who gave the order? That's where things remain delicately vague. Harold's direct responsibility is still debated by historians like they're trying to litigate a crime scene with only a torn-up parchment and half a candle. Some think Harold merely turned a blind eye. Others suggest he orchestrated it with full awareness that in the business of royal succession, sympathy is a weakness, and clarity comes only when the options are dead. The moral sheen of divine kingship always coexisted with the murky reality of political pruning. Alfred was one of many victims of dynastic necessity, conveniently removed, inconveniently mourned. His blinding wasn't just violence, it was symbolic. A rival's eyes destroyed to extinguish a line of sight to the crown. A future unseeable by force. Harold Harefoot would rule for a brief and largely forgotten reign, dying in 1040. Alfred, meanwhile, lived on as a question mark in royal memory, commemorated less for what he did and more for what was done to him. And England, by then, had grown used to these small deletions of inconvenient royalty. It would need to. There were many more to come, like, say, the deliberate starving of entire regions to crush a rebellion. Because what's the point of a crown if you can't use it to burn the fields beneath your enemy's feet? 2. Starvation as state policy. Between 1069 and 1070, England saw a punishment so methodical and cold-blooded, it still echoes through the dust of the North. William Wise, the Conqueror, if you're into titles, the Scorched Earth King, if you're into accuracy, had just faced rebellion in Yorkshire and Durham. And like many kings, he took disobedience personally. What came next wasn't war, it was erasure, not just of armies, but of crops, livestock, entire villages. The campaign is known, if not euphemistically, by a chilling name, the Harrying of the North. It sounds like a military expedition. It was closer to state-sanctioned starvation. Contemporary chroniclers describe charred ruins stretching from York to Durham, and corpses unburied in the fields. Orderic Vitalis, one of the few monks with a spine, called it a barbarous slaughter. William of Malmesbury accused the king of having left the land empty of people and food, and that was the point. Modern historians largely agree that William's campaign was deliberate. It wasn't about defeating armies. It was about making rebellion logistically impossible. No food, no resistance, no people, no problem. Famine is public policy. The kind of logic only a spreadsheet or a sovereign could love. And it worked. The rebellion stopped. The North was broken. It would take generations for the population to recover. Some villages never did. The Domesday Book, compiled more than a decade later, lists whole swaths of Yorkshire as waste. In other words, still uninhabitable, not just killed, emptied. Was it legal? Absolutely. William was the king, and kings conveniently get to define legality. Was it moral? That question rarely came up in the Norman court. This was medieval governance, not Sunday school, and William wasn't interested in hearts. He was interested in harvests, and what happened when they disappeared. In a sense, the harrying wasn't an aberration, it was a blueprint. Royal power, unchecked and insulated, has always had a talent for scaling violence until it looks like order. England would remember William as the founder of a new era, but his foundation was laid over ash and famine. The next time someone tells you monarchy is a quaint relic of the past, remind them it used to come with a scorched earth policy. And sometimes when the paperwork got messy, kings just preferred accidents. Like, say, an arrow loosed a little too cleanly in a forest no one really saw. 2 stories in, and already monarchy's looking less like a fairy tale and more like a medieval power grab with better costumes. If you're into this kind of late-night historical unraveling, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's still to come. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I want to know who else is staying up late to eavesdrop on history's best-kept secrets. 3. A king killed in the forest. Accident or conspiracy? On a summer day in 1100, King William II, nicknamed Rufus, perhaps for his red hair, or more ominously, the flush of his temperament, rode into the New Forest with a hunting party. He did not ride out. By the evening, the king was dead, pierced by an arrow. An accident, said the official murmurs, but medieval accidents had a curious tendency to benefit someone very specific. The story goes that the fatal shot came from one Sir Walter Tyrrell, an accomplished archer and guest of the king. In the version most often told, Tyrrell loosed a misaimed arrow at a stag, and it struck William instead. But almost immediately the details began to blur, and not in the way genuine accidents usually do. There was no inquest, no formal investigation, no real pause. Tyrrell, that unfortunate hunter, fled the country with suspicious haste. And most telling of all, within hours, William's younger brother Henry galloped to Winchester and secured the royal treasury. By nightfall, he had declared himself king. Efficiency? Certainly. Innocence? Less certain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually terse, noted the death with a peculiar flatness. Other chroniclers began to fill in the gaps with suspicion, speculation, and a dose of poetic justice. William II had not been a loved king. He'd clashed with the church, taxed heavily, and ruled with the charm of a boot on your throat. In the centuries since, historians have struggled to piece together a clearer image. Was his death truly a mistake in the woods, or the perfect murder disguised as misfortune? The setting itself raises questions. The New Forest wasn't just any forest. It was a royal hunting ground, yes, but also a place where William's own relatives had met strange ends. His older brother Richard had died there decades earlier, another hunting accident. The Norman chroniclers began to whisper about a cursed forest, but curses, too, are often shorthand for systemic elimination. As for Sir Walter Tyrrell, his descendants always denied the killing. He himself never confessed, never stood trial, and never returned to clear his name. That absence, like many royal silences, was louder than guilt. Modern historians are divided. Some lean toward the simplest explanation. Accidents do happen, even to kings. Others argue that Henry's immediate power grab is hard to ignore, and at the very least, opportunistic. The line between conspiracy and convenience in medieval politics is, at best, a dotted one. Rufus's death was clean, sudden, and left no room for resistance. And perhaps that was the point. Today, there's a modest stone in the New Forest marking the supposed site of the king's fall. Visitors rarely linger long. The place has the air of something hushed up long ago, its neatness suspicious, its legend too polished. A king felled by chance or cleared out by design. Either way, power changed hands with remarkable speed, and England didn't mourn too loudly. But fate, or ambition, wasn't done toying with royal blood just yet, because barely 2 decades later, an entire ship of heirs would vanish beneath the waves, and England would plunge into a dynastic darkness it barely crawled out of. 4. The White Ship Disaster and Dynastic Catastrophe. The night of November 25, 1120 was supposed to mark a smooth sail toward stability. Instead, it became a date carved into the bedrock of England's royal disasters. The White Ship, a gleaming new vessel said to be the fastest on the Channel, was chosen to carry many of the most elite young nobles of the Anglo-Norman realm back to England after a diplomatic mission in Normandy. Among them was William Adelin, the only legitimate son and heir of King Henry I. William was 17, heir to an empire, and said to be confident, entitled, and not entirely loved. But none of that mattered. He was the future, or so everyone assumed. The ship never made it out of the harbor. Accounts vary in tone but agree on the core event. The ship struck a submerged rock shortly after leaving port and sank in cold black waters. Nearly everyone on board drowned, including William Adelin. A few survivors were pulled from the wreckage, but they were politically irrelevant. The only heir to the English throne was gone, and with him, the clear line of succession. It's not just the tragedy of youth that makes the White Ship infamous. It's the consequences. Because what followed was a dynastic unraveling of monumental proportions. With no male heir, Henry I spent years trying to secure the succession of his daughter Matilda, an effort that was only partly successful. When Henry died, the crown was quickly seized by his nephew Stephen. What ensued is now known, somewhat politely, as the anarchy. It was not a short-term disruption. It was nearly 2 decades of civil war, shifting alliances, sieges, betrayals, and a slow collapse of royal authority. The White Ship wasn't just a maritime accident. It was a pressure valve exploding, exposing how little was actually holding England's royal machinery together. In a society that placed enormous political weight on bloodlines, the sudden erasure of the male heir was more than personal tragedy, it was systemic crisis. Some chroniclers were quick to frame the disaster as divine punishment. Perhaps it was the arrogance of the passengers, or the overconfidence in new technology, or the drinking. Plenty of narrative embroidery exists. But modern historians strip away the superstition and see something grimmer. A moment when the concentration of power in a single body made the entire realm absurdly fragile. One bad boat ride, and the kingdom fell into chaos. There's a poetic irony in the fact that the ship carrying England's future was called the White Ship. It sounds almost ceremonial, clean, bright, inevitable. But destiny has always had a dark sense of humor, especially when it comes to royal succession. William Adelin never ruled, but his absence ruled over decades of English history. And his cousin Matilda would spend much of her life fighting to reclaim what drowned that night. She would eventually lose her claim, but not before setting in motion a generation of political vengeance, family betrayal, and one particularly clever queen who would be locked away for nearly 2 decades, remembered not as a monarch, but as something more dangerous, a woman with power. 5. Imprisoned witch queen. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry II in 1152, she brought with her more than just vast lands, political clout, and a previous royal marriage. She brought agency, real, dangerous agency. And that, as it turned out, was a problem. Eleanor had already been Queen of France before she became Queen of England. She had led armies, negotiated treaties, and moved through the chessboard of European politics, not like a pawn or even a queen, but more like a second player. And when she and Henry had 8 children, some of them loyal, many of them rebellious, the balance of power began to fracture under the weight of its own ambition. By 1173, Eleanor had aligned herself with 3 of her sons in a revolt against Henry. A bold move, certainly. A calculated risk, perhaps. A betrayal. Depends on your perspective. Henry saw it for what it was, a threat, and he responded accordingly. Eleanor was captured, though, as usual, the historical record is careful not to dwell too long on the moment of her arrest. From then on, for the better part of 16 years, she lived under what the records call guarded conditions. Not quite a prison, but not quite freedom either. She was shuffled from castle to castle, kept under surveillance, denied political participation, and gradually erased from court life. It was punishment by invisibility. Was it legal? Entirely. She had, after all, taken up arms against her king. But the subtext was louder than the statute. Eleanor was being contained not just for what she had done, but for who she was, an intelligent, politically savvy woman with a dangerous level of influence. To justify her detainment, some chroniclers began leaning into the language of medieval paranoia. She was called cunning, manipulative, enchanting in the wrong way. Not quite a witch, but not one either. The line between strong woman and sorceress was thin when thrones were involved. And yet, Eleanor endured. Unlike many sidelined royals, she was neither executed nor quietly disposed of. Instead, she waited. When Henry died in 1189 and their son Richard took the throne, the first thing he did was release his mother. Within weeks, Eleanor was managing the realm again, negotiating Richard's release from captivity abroad, governing as regent and outmaneuvering her political enemies well into her 70s. So why lock her away in the first place? Because Eleanor was proof that power in the wrong hands, by which we mean not male hands, made the throne tremble. Her imprisonment wasn't just about treason, it was about containment. Not of a person, but of an idea. That a queen could be more than ornamental. That she could command, conspire, and worst of all, win. And for a king like Henry II, that was more threatening than any battlefield. Because once Eleanor was confined, the crown could be polished back into its preferred shape. Rigid, masculine, absolute. Until, of course, the law itself became the next tool of royal domination. Because while Eleanor sat in guarded silence, her husband was busy transforming English justice into something sharp enough to rule by and cruel enough to fear. 6. Royal power and judicial brutality. When Henry II took the throne in 1154, he inherited more than a fractured kingdom. He inherited a legal system that barely qualified as one. England was a patchwork of local customs, baronial whims, and leftover Norman decrees. Loyalty was personal, law was flexible, and enforcement was as consistent as the weather. To Henry, this was intolerable. Or more accurately, it was inefficient. So he did what any pragmatic king with a taste for control would do. He rebuilt the state. And he did it through law. Henry's legal reforms are often praised as the foundations of English common law, and rightly so. He professionalized royal justice, created traveling judges, expanded writs, standardized procedures, and made the king's courts the final word on everything from land disputes to homicide. But this is not a heartwarming tale of civic improvement. It's a story of how law became a tool of domination. Because with every innovation, Henry tightened the noose. Local courts were undercut. Barons lost power. Ordinary people were brought under royal jurisdiction, but not necessarily for their benefit. The law was centralized, yes, but it was centralized into the hands of one man. And that man didn't believe in leniency. Punishments under Henry's reign became a language of fear. Harsh penalties weren't just permitted, they were publicized. Royal justice made examples. The accused faced a system where guilt could be determined by ordeal, by rumor, by proximity to power. Trial by jury existed, but it was a far cry from modern impartiality. Accusation was often enough, and even when procedures were followed to the letters were written by the crown. Some of the period's chroniclers noted the efficiency with admiration. After all, roads were safer, and disputes could be settled by law rather than sword. But modern historians with fewer illusions point out the darker symmetry. Henry didn't just build a justice system. He built a weapon, and like any weapon, it had its targets. Political enemies could be prosecuted under vague charges of treason or sedition. Royal officials could use legal pretexts to extract fines, seize property, or enforce obedience. The very act of appealing to the king's court often meant accepting his verdict in advance. Henry's use of legal power reached its most dramatic and infamous climax in his conflict with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. But even before that fatal feud, the writing was on the parchment. Law would no longer be a negotiated space. It would be the crown's instrument, and the crown had sharp edges. What Henry created wasn't just a legal system, it was a bureaucracy of control. And for all its modern echoes of fairness, its roots were grown in fear. The state was being born, yes, but not with soft hands. Because soon, that legal machinery would be turned against one of Henry's own allies, then enemies, then martyrs. A man whose death would haunt the crown for generations. A man who tried to stand between the throne and God and ended up on a cathedral floor. 7. The Becket Crisis. A murder enabled by royal rage. In the early 1170s, England's most powerful alliance unraveled in spectacular fashion, not between rival kingdoms, but between a king and his former friend. Henry II and Thomas Becket were once political allies, close enough to trust each other with matters of church and state. Becket, the charming and capable royal chancellor, was elevated to Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162 with Henry's blessing. The goal was simple: consolidate the church under royal control. Becket was supposed to be a loyalist in robes. Instead, he became something far more dangerous: a true believer. Almost immediately, Becket pivoted. He shed the trappings of court life and began defending clerical independence with the zeal of a man who had something to prove. Henry, used to obedience, took it personally. Their dispute spiraled quickly, from administrative disagreements to outright war of wills. At its heart was a single question: should the king's justice apply to the clergy, or did the church answer only to God? This wasn't just a religious spat. It was a constitutional standoff. Becket refused to sign the Constitutions of Clarendon, Henry's attempt to codify royal authority over church courts. Excommunications flew. Appeals to Rome multiplied. Both men dug trenches in parchment and principle. And the more Becket defied him, the more Henry seethed. Then, in December 1170, the king, far from Canterbury, possibly drunk, definitely furious, is said to have exploded with a now legendary outburst. Something along the lines of, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The words were not a command, not officially, but to 4 knights in earshot they were close enough. The knights rode to Canterbury. Days later, Becket was dead in his cathedral. Not in battle, not in court, at the altar. The news stunned Europe. Becket, the once loyal courtier turned clerical thorn, was suddenly a martyr. Miracles were reported. Pilgrims flooded to his tomb, and Henry, confronted with the fallout, found himself in a moral and political crisis of his own making. Modern historians still debate the fine print. Did Henry intend Becket's death? Probably not in so many words. But his fury created a climate where loyalty meant interpretation, and power could become unspoken permission. The murder wasn't ordered, it was enabled. Henry eventually performed public penance, but Becket's ghost haunted his reign and his dynasty. The crown had overreached, and it had done so in a way that couldn't be smoothed over with law or coin. For once, royal power had found its limit, not in rebellion, but in sanctity. And yet, the lesson was short-lived, because after Henry, another king would rule not with fury, but with fear. And when a young royal heir with a rival claim vanished behind castle walls, the question wasn't whether the king was angry, it was whether he was responsible. 8. The disappearance of a boy heir. In the spring of 1203, a boy vanished, and with him, a piece of England's moral claim to the crown. His name was Arthur of Brittany, and he was young, royal, and in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or rather, in the wrong family. Arthur was the teenage nephew of King John, and under a strict reading of dynastic logic, he had a better claim to the throne than John did. As the son of Geoffrey, John's older brother, Arthur was, in the eyes of many continental barons and a fair number of chroniclers, the rightful heir to Richard the Lionheart. But dynastic rules have always bent under the weight of ambition, and John, ever the opportunist, had no intention of letting a teenager unseat him, especially not one who'd been born in Brittany and raised with a claim that made English lords nervous. The political backdrop was a continent in flux. England still controlled large swaths of territory in France, but that grip was weakening. In 1202, Arthur allied with King Philip II of France and led a rebellion against John's rule in Normandy. It was bold, it was audacious, and it failed. Arthur was captured by John's forces and imprisoned at Falaise, then transferred to Rouen, closer to the heart of English-controlled lands in Normandy and further from public view. And then, as records tend to say when they are trying not to say too much, Arthur disappeared. No trial, no announcement, no funeral, just gone. Contemporary sources are damning, if vague. The Annals of Margam write, after King John had captured Arthur and kept him alive in prison for some time, he killed him with his own hand and threw him into the Seine with a large stone tied to the body. It's the kind of statement that reads like a guilty conscience dressed up as history. Other chroniclers offer more diplomatic phrasings. Modern historians are cautious. There's no forensic evidence, no definitive smoking dagger, but the consensus is this. Arthur never left that castle alive. The only thing less clear than how he died is how John managed to make the body, and the fallout, disappear. Whatever the details, the damage was done. Arthur's death, or presumed death, ignited a political firestorm. Nobles in Brittany and Anjou turned on John. Even in England, trust eroded. By 1204, John had lost almost all his French territories. The French king smiled. The English barons took notes. And the Pope, soon enough, would take sides. In the years that followed, John's reign continued to unravel. But the disappearance of Arthur cast a long shadow. It wasn't just the removal of a rival. It was the disappearance of innocence, the quiet acknowledgement that a child could be eliminated if his bloodline was too dangerous. It was, in short, the moment John stopped being a king with enemies and started being a king people feared. But fear alone wasn't enough to hold a crown, and John knew that better than anyone, so he turned to another time-tested strategy for maintaining power, taking hostages, preferably young ones, preferably noble, preferably terrified. 9. Royal hostages as policy. By the early 1200s, King John had perfected a particular brand of governance, part intimidation, part paperwork, and entirely personal. The barons were restless, the church was hostile, the crown lands were shrinking, and John, having possibly eliminated his nephew Arthur, now operated in a haze of distrust. So how do you hold a kingdom together when no one trusts you? You don't win hearts, you seize leverage, preferably in the form of someone else's children. Hostage-taking wasn't new in medieval politics, but under John, It matured from occasional necessity into official policy. Nobles who wanted to show loyalty, or were simply trying not to die, were often required to hand over a family member, typically a son or daughter, as a kind of living collateral. If the family rebelled, cooperated with enemies, or simply hesitated when summoned, the implication was clear. Their loved one would suffer the consequences. And this wasn't a hidden practice. It was bureaucratized, recorded in administrative rolls, documented in royal writs. The crown treated it as standard procedure, with the casual tone of a king asking for horses or taxes. But these weren't just names on a ledger. They were children, hosted at royal castles, kept under guard, raised in a world where playtime and peril coexisted uncomfortably. The historian's consensus is blunt. Hostage policy under King John was real, deliberate, and systemic. And the stakes were not symbolic. The king didn't just keep hostages, he used them. Chroniclers of the time recount incidents where hostages were reportedly harmed or even executed when their families betrayed the crown. Whether these acts were routine or exceptional is debated. What isn't debated is the fear they created. It wasn't just about cruelty, it was strategy. John was an unpopular king. His military campaigns were collapsing. His political base was fraying. In the absence of charisma, he leaned into control. If a noble lord couldn't be trusted, perhaps his son would think twice. Perhaps his daughter would encourage obedience in a father who couldn't bear the thought of royal punishment. The crown became both jailer and guardian. In theory, this fostered loyalty. In practice, it seeded rebellion. Nobles resented the humiliation. Families never forgot the fear. By the time Magna Carta was forced on John in 1215, one of the clauses, number 50, for the detail-oriented, specifically demanded the removal of certain royal officials known for their harshness, especially in relation to hostages. It was a quiet admission. This policy had gone too far. And yet, the logic was medievally sound. Power was personal. Control was physical. And nothing reminded a rebellious lord of his place quite like the knowledge that his child slept behind royal walls, under lock, under watch, and entirely outside his protection. But some royals weren't just hostages. They were never allowed to grow into political tools or future claimants. Some were hidden so thoroughly, confined for so long, they became little more than shadows in the historical record. Like one royal girl, born into the Plantagenet bloodline, who spent nearly 4 decades as a ghost in royal custody. Not dead, just never allowed to live. 10. A royal girl raised as a prisoner. Eleanor of Brittany was born into the highest reaches of the English royal family and paid for it with her freedom. She was the daughter of Geoffrey Plantagenet, older brother to King John and the same father who had once made Arthur of Brittany a serious threat to John's crown. After Arthur's sudden disappearance in 1203, Eleanor became, by default, the next dynastic headache. She was young, unmarried, and most importantly, she had a stronger hereditary claim to the throne than the man actually sitting on it, which meant she could never be allowed to exist in public again. Eleanor didn't rebel. She didn't conspire. She didn't even have the chance. At around age 20, she simply disappeared into royal custody, where she would remain for nearly 40 years. Not executed, not exiled, just contained, legally invisible, politically untouchable, and quietly erased. She was moved from castle to castle. Corfe, Bristol, Gloucester, always watched, never released. The official reasoning was straightforward: security. Eleanor might become a rallying point for factions opposed to John or, later, to his son Henry III. A foreign king might try to marry her. A rebellious noble might see in her a puppet queen. The risks, in the eyes of the crown, outweighed every other consideration. But in practical terms, Eleanor's life was a slow-motion imprisonment that spanned nearly her entire adulthood. She took no husband. She had no children. She wielded no authority. She was occasionally granted luxuries, a retinue of servants, decent accommodations, and once, reportedly, a pet. But her cage was still a cage, and while the records use the polite language of custody, the reality is unmistakable. Eleanor was a royal threat neutralized not by death, but by permanent isolation. What makes her story especially chilling is its longevity. She wasn't imprisoned as a temporary measure during a political crisis. She was a permanent file marked, "Do not open." Even when Henry III stabilized his reign, even when it became clear that Eleanor posed no active threat, she remained locked away. To release her would have been to reopen a question the monarchy didn't want asked. What happens when the wrong person has the right blood? Chroniclers rarely mention her. She wasn't part of major events. She didn't play a visible role in court politics. She became, in effect, a ghost, alive in body, but erased from public life. When she finally died in 1241, she was still in captivity. She had outlived King John by a quarter century, outlasted her political relevance by decades, and left behind no direct descendants to tell her story. And that may have been the goal all along. A dynastic problem solved not through force, but through forgetting. Eleanor's life is a quiet but brutal reminder of how royal politics didn't just destroy its enemies, it removed them from memory. And when memory didn't cooperate, the state could intervene more forcefully. Just ask the people expelled from England entirely under royal orders. Not nobles, not heirs, just the wrong religion at the wrong time, with the wrong king on the throne. 11. The expulsion of England's Jews. In 1290, King Edward I signed an edict that would alter English history for the next 350 years. It was short, definitive, and brutal in its finality. All Jews were to be expelled from the kingdom. No conditions, no appeal. Just a royal decree that one of England's oldest communities no longer had a place in the realm. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was the culmination of nearly a century of mounting pressure, restriction, and state-backed hostility. From the time of the Norman conquest, England's Jewish population had been officially protected by the crown, classified tellingly as royal property. That designation came with legal immunity, but also with a price tag. Jews could be taxed, regulated, and used by the monarchy as tools of financial extraction. When kings needed cash, and they always did, Jewish moneylenders were expected to provide it, willingly or not. In return, the crown offered what it framed as protection. But protection under medieval monarchy was a slippery thing. It could be revoked, sold, or turned into a justification for surveillance and control. By the 1270s, Edward I had imposed a cascade of restrictions. Jews were banned from most professions. They were forced to wear identifying badges. Synagogues were monitored. Legal rights were narrowed. Accusations, often fabricated, spread easily. Some were accused of coin clipping, others of conspiracy, and worst of all, of ritual crimes that had no basis in fact but great utility in stirring up fear. And yet, Jews remained in England. They lived in cities like London, York, Lincoln, and Norwich. They built communities, ran businesses, raised families, and existed in the strange liminal space between royal exploitation and public hostility. That changed in 1290. The Edict of Expulsion was signed in July. It gave England's Jewish population until November to leave the country. Thousands fled. Estimates range from 2,000 to 16,000, though the exact number is uncertain. Many left behind property that was confiscated. Some were robbed or attacked en route. Others vanished into the fog of undocumented exile. Why did Edward act when he did? Historians point to several factors. Politically, the move placated increasingly anti-Jewish sentiment among the barons and the church. Financially, Edward had already squeezed much of what he could from Jewish moneylenders, and foreign loans were beginning to take their place. And symbolically, the expulsion was a crown-pleasing display of piety, one that conveniently aligned with his image as a Christian warrior king fresh off his campaigns in Wales and soon to move against Scotland. The edict was not reversed until 1656, during the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. By then, The medieval Jewish community had become a distant memory, one buried under centuries of royal silence. What makes the 1290 expulsion so stark is not just its cruelty, but its legality. It was signed, sealed, and enforced with all the dignity of royal procedure. No trial, no specific crime, no individual verdict. Just a community erased by policy. And if Edward could do that to a population he'd once promised to protect, imagine what he could do to another king. A living monarch, one with a crown, one with a kingdom Edward wanted for himself. Because the next royal victim wouldn't be a subject, he'd be a sovereign. And Edward would make sure that even a king could be reduced to a trophy. 12. A king deported as a captive trophy. In 1296, King Edward III of England marched into Scotland, not with a peace offering, but with an army, a legal argument, and a habit of taking things that didn't belong to him. His target was not just land or allegiance, it was a monarch, a living, breathing symbol of sovereignty, and Edward would leave with him in chains. John Balliol, King of Scots, reluctantly crowned in 1292 after being chosen by Edward himself during a messy succession crisis, was never truly allowed to rule. From the beginning, he was treated less like a king and more like a client state administrator. Edward referred to himself as Lord Paramount of Scotland, demanded homage, and expected compliance. Balliol, wedged between baronial expectations at home and imperial pressure from the south, attempted to assert independence. He made diplomatic overtures to France, resisted English taxation, and eventually refused to answer summons to Edward's court. This, to Edward, was not poor diplomacy. It was treason. So in 1296, Edward invaded. The campaign was swift and ruthless. Scottish resistance crumbled. Berwick-upon-Tweed was sacked, and the town's population suffered heavily in the assault. Balliol surrendered before summer, but Edward wasn't content with just military victory. He wanted to humiliate his rival. And so, the King of Scotland was stripped of his royal regalia in a public ceremony. His crown, his seal, his title, all surrendered. The act was so ceremonially degrading it was given a nickname, Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat, referencing the symbolic removal of Balliol's heraldic arms. A king unmade by royal theater. Edward then deported Balliol to England, first to the Tower of London, then to remote captivity. Eventually, after years of quiet seclusion, he was allowed to retire to his family's estates in France, where he faded into irrelevance. But the damage had been done. A sovereign monarch had been turned into a souvenir of conquest. This wasn't just about one man. It was about sending a message that Edward's vision of monarchy didn't stop at his own borders. That kingship too could be conquered, and that defiance, even from a crowned head, would be met with theatrical humiliation. Edward's conquest didn't hold for long. Scottish resistance reignited under leaders like William Wallace and later Robert the Bruce. The wars of Scottish independence would stretch on for decades, but Balliol's fall set the tone, a warning to future challengers that the English crown would not hesitate to dismantle royalty itself if it meant preserving supremacy. Historians see Edward's treatment of Balliol as calculated dominance. He didn't kill him. He didn't even exile him outright. Instead, he downgraded him, removing the idea of Scottish sovereignty from public life by turning its king into a quiet, captive relic. And if a crowned rival could be paraded into England and erased from relevance, what hope was there for a fallen English king? Especially one whose death came in secrecy, wrapped in suspicion, with whispers of murder in the air and not a single witness brave enough to say what really happened. 13. The death of Edward II. Murder, cover-up, or natural end. Edward II was never meant to be a tragic figure. He was born into triumph, the son of Edward I, a king who conquered Wales, humbled Scotland, and ruled with relentless authority. But the son was not the father. Where Edward I was iron and stone, Edward II was music and gardens. He preferred the company of friends to barons, and his reign, beginning in 1307, quickly became a slow-motion unraveling of royal authority. The seeds of his downfall were sown early. Edward alienated the nobility by elevating favorites, most notoriously Piers Gaveston, whose influence at court caused scandal and resentment. When Gaveston was executed by rebellious lords in 1312, Edward never forgot, and never forgave. He spent the rest of his reign trying to claw back control from an increasingly hostile aristocracy, only to fall deeper into political chaos. By the 1320s, England was functionally ruled by a small clique around Hugh Despenser the Younger, another royal favorite whose greed and tyranny made enemies in every direction. But Edward's real undoing came from within his own household. His wife, Isabella of France, had been humiliated by the rise of the Despensers, and when she crossed the Channel on a diplomatic mission in 1325, she simply didn't come back. Instead, she joined forces with Roger Mortimer, a powerful exile and former rebel. Together, they raised an army, landed in England, and moved swiftly. Edward's support collapsed. The Despensers were captured and executed. Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, Edward III. And then, quite suddenly, he was no longer king. The official records say he was imprisoned, first at Kenilworth Castle, then moved to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. By September 1327, word arrived that the former king was dead. Natural causes, they said. Nothing suspicious. The timing? Coincidental. The political convenience? Unmentioned. But no one believed it. Almost immediately, rumors swirled. Chroniclers wrote with a noticeable lack of certainty. Some claimed Edward had been murdered in his cell. Others whispered about assassins sent by Isabella and Mortimer. The most lurid versions, crafted with more imagination than evidence, painted scenes of torture and poetic vengeance. Modern historians are skeptical of the more sensational tales, but most agree on one thing. Edward's death was far too convenient. What's more, documents from the years that followed hint at lingering doubts. There were reports, credible or not, of Edward's sightings abroad. A letter surfaced in the 1330s alleging that he had escaped and was living in exile. Edward III, now grown and reigning in his own right, eventually had Mortimer executed and distanced himself from the murkiness of his father's demise. So, what killed Edward II? Illness? Murder? A quiet order passed through the chain of command with plausible deniability? We still don't know. And perhaps that's the most telling part of the story. A king deposed by his own wife and her lover, imprisoned, and gone under suspicious silence. But his wasn't the last throne to collapse under the weight of marital betrayal. Because Isabella of France wasn't content with merely removing a king, she planned to rule in his place. And in doing so, she would ignite one of the strangest and most scandalous royal interregnums in English history. 14. A queen's coup against her husband. In 1326, Queen Isabella of France returned to England not as a consort, but as a conqueror. She landed on the coast with a small mercenary force, her teenage son by her side, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, at the helm. It was less an invasion than an unraveling. Edward II's regime, already brittle with unpopularity, snapped almost immediately. Nobles defected. Cities opened their gates. The once mighty king was soon on the run, while Isabella marched through her husband's kingdom like a monarch in waiting. But this wasn't merely a rebellion. It was a royal inversion. The queen had taken up arms against the king, a spectacle so rare it shocked even cynical chroniclers. Marital politics had always played a part in dynastic squabbles, but Isabella went further. She overthrew her husband, imprisoned him, and, crucially, did not hand the crown to Mortimer, but to her son, the young Edward III. It was a masterstroke of legitimacy. Technically, the king had abdicated in favor of his heir. Officially, Isabella and Mortimer were just the guardians of the new regime. Unofficially, they ruled with unchallenged authority. And for a brief period, England was governed not by a king, but by a queen and her consort, not through marriage, but through mutiny. This period, from late 1326 to 1330, was one of uneasy regency. Isabella and Mortimer acted with sweeping power, seizing lands, punishing enemies, and rewarding allies. Mortimer was elevated to Earl of March and lived openly at court. Isabella, meanwhile, signed charters, negotiated treaties, and issued commands in her son's name. For some, it felt like stability. For others, it looked a lot like a royal hijacking. And they weren't wrong. Mortimer became known, without affection, as the king in all but name. His arrogance grew with his titles. Political opponents were silenced or pushed aside. One of the boldest acts came in 1328 when they signed a treaty with Scotland recognizing Robert the Bruce's independence, an unthinkable move for the Plantagenet crown. Many saw it as a betrayal. Others saw it as pragmatism. Either way, it weakened their support. But their most fatal mistake was forgetting that Edward III was not a child forever. By 1330, at age 17, the young king was no longer content to be a figurehead. With the help of loyal nobles, Edward staged a coup of his own. Mortimer was seized, tried, and executed. Isabella, spared but disgraced, was quietly retired from power, given a comfortable exile in Castle Rising, far from court. No trial, no public shaming, just silence. Historians continue to debate Isabella's role. Was she a power-hungry traitor? A wronged queen pushed to desperation? A mother protecting her son's inheritance from a corrupt king? The truth may lie somewhere in between. What is clear is that she did what few royal women had dared before. She rewrote the script. And yet, even in her triumph, Isabella was not immune to the machinery of royal politics. Power, once seized, is rarely shared. Mortimer was dead. Edward III was king in more than just name. And the lesson was sharp. Favorites rise fast and fall faster. Especially if you're a man too close to a king, too ambitious for your own good, and just influential enough to make the entire realm uncomfortable. 15. The fall of a favorite: power, sex, and politics. In 1312, a body was left in a field near Warwick. It belonged to Piers Gaveston, royal favorite, sometime exile, returned aristocrat, and depending on whom you asked, either the most dangerous man in England or the most unjustly maligned. His death marked the culmination of a scandal that had gripped the realm and fractured the court. But his real crime wasn't written in any statute. His real crime was being too close to the king. Gaveston entered English politics not with blood, but with charm. A minor noble from Gascony, he met the future Edward II as a young prince. The two formed a close bond. How close remains a matter of historical conjecture. But what is clear is that Edward trusted him above almost anyone else. When Edward ascended the throne in 1307, one of his first acts was to recall Gaveston from exile and shower him with titles, lands, and unprecedented access to royal authority. This did not go unnoticed. The English barons, already wary of royal centralization, saw in Gaveston a dangerous interloper. He was not only elevated beyond his station, but wielded his influence with a theatrical confidence that verged on mockery. He gave mocking nicknames to powerful lords. He wore silks and performed in tournaments with a flamboyance unbecoming of his rank. The court, in their view, was becoming a stage, and Gaveston was its preening lead actor. But this wasn't just court gossip. It was a political crisis. The barons demanded his removal. Parliament issued edicts. Edward defied them. Gaveston was exiled, then recalled, then exiled again. Each return only increased the tension. Each pardon was a statement of royal defiance. By 1311, the pressure had reached its breaking point. A group of nobles, styling themselves as the Lords Ordainers, took it upon themselves to reform the monarchy and limit Edward's power, starting with Gaveston. When Gaveston returned again in 1312, they acted. He was seized, imprisoned briefly, and then, without royal permission, executed. The killing was extrajudicial but politically calculated. The barons claimed it was necessary for the stability of the realm. Edward claimed it was treason, but in reality it was something else. A warning. Royal favorites might enjoy the king's affection, but they did not enjoy the kingdom's protection. Historians have long debated the nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship. Was it a romantic attachment? A political dependency? An emotional crutch for a king unprepared for rule? The answer may be less important than the result. Gaveston's elevation destabilized the monarchy, undermined Edward's authority, and triggered a cycle of rebellion and retaliation that would plague the reign for years to come. His death did not resolve the tensions. It simply shifted them. Edward II would go on to favor others, most disastrously, the Despensers. And the nobility would continue to circle, never forgetting the lesson of Gaveston. When a monarch plays favorites too visibly, the realm has a way of responding. And when those favorites fall, others often pay the price. Sometimes entire families, sometimes children. Because in royal politics, lineage isn't protection, it's leverage. Just ask the sons and daughters used as living chess pieces in England's most strategic marriages. 16. Royal children used as pawns in adult wars. In the royal game of power, childhood was a formality, something that could be negotiated away, rebranded, or sold for influence. For the children of the English monarchy in the 14th century, innocence was never a shield. It was a currency. And no one understood that better than Edward III. Following his ascent to the throne in 1327, Edward, like his predecessors, found himself navigating a realm of shifting loyalties, unstable alliances, and a political landscape where peace was a luxury. To maintain control, expand influence, or simply keep enemies close, he turned to the most dependable form of soft power, marriage. Not his own, of course. That had already been arranged. But his children? They were royal assets with bloodline value, and they could be deployed with precision. This wasn't new. Marriages had long been used as diplomatic glue, but Edward elevated the tactic to something more systematized, more strategic. His sons and daughters were married off to nobles across England and Europe, not because of love or compatibility, but because each union locked another piece of the political map into place. In the 1330s and 1340s, Edward began forging marital contracts for his children at increasingly young ages. Treaties were built around these arrangements. In many cases, negotiations began before the child in question could write their name. Royal daughters were paired with continental lords to ensure peace or win military support. Sons were promised to heiresses with vast estates, binding noble wealth to royal ambition. At the time, this was seen as both practical and proper. Dynasty required continuity. Continuity required alliances. Alliances required children. But behind the gloss of court ceremonies and wedding feasts was a harder truth. These marriages were not personal choices. They were political impositions. Consent was assumed. Resistance was not encouraged. The records from the period reflect this calculated coldness. Wardships, legal guardianships over underage heirs, were bought and sold like assets. The guardian could arrange the ward's marriage, often to their own relatives, turning inheritance into strategic capital. Children were moved like tokens, placed in castles not for education, but for containment until a match could be finalized. Some of these matches worked. Others ended in political disaster, emotional estrangement, or early widowhood. But the system endured because it served the crown. It ensured loyalty. It produced heirs. It wove the monarchy deeper into the noble fabric of England, and tethered aristocratic ambition to the king's will. Modern historians view this era's dynastic policy with a blend of admiration and discomfort. It was effective. It was ruthless. It was normalized. But in the shadow of every treaty stood a child, handed over not as a gift, but as a guarantee. And sometimes even that wasn't enough. Because when treaties broke down, when succession was contested, and when rivals returned, kings had to make harder choices. Not about marriage, about elimination. Quiet, permanent, and one day, not even a crowned king would be safe from that fate. Just ask Richard II, if you can find his grave. 17. a deposed king left to die in captivity. Richard II was not overthrown in the chaos of battle. He didn't fall screaming from a war horse, nor was he struck down by foreign invaders. His collapse came slowly, bureaucratically, wrapped in parchment, parliamentary process, and the illusion of consent. In 1399, the king who had once ruled with divine absolutism was quietly deposed, and within a year, he was dead. No one ever proved how. Richard had ascended the throne in 1377 as a child of 10, a boy king during a turbulent century. England had just emerged from the Black Death, the 100 Years' War was grinding on, and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 had shattered any myth of national stability. In that climate, Richard's early reign was handled by advisors and regents, men who wielded power in his name, while the boy watched and learned. But Richard learned something different from his predecessors. He absorbed the aesthetics of kingship, the ceremonial weight of divine rule. He believed in absolutism, in the majesty of monarchy, in the crown as something more than just inheritance. And when he came of age, he ruled accordingly. The problem was, England wasn't interested in that kind of king. As he matured, Richard clashed with his nobles, especially a group of powerful aristocrats known as the Lords Appellant. These men resented his centralization of power, his favoring of unpopular courtiers, and his tendency to see disagreement as disloyalty. After a brief and bitter political exile, Richard returned to authority in the 1390s and spent the last years of his reign methodically dismantling his enemies' power. It was retribution, but it was also a mistake. Because when Henry Bolingbroke, the exiled Duke of Hereford and son of John of Gaunt, returned to England in 1399 to claim his father's lands, he found widespread support. Richard, away in Ireland, misjudged the moment. By the time he returned, Bolingbroke had effectively taken control of the kingdom. Richard surrendered without a fight. He was formally deposed in Parliament, a process dressed up in legal legitimacy but built on expedience and threat. Henry was crowned Henry IV. Richard was sent to Pontefract Castle. And then, silence. By early 1400, he was dead. The official cause, unclear. Some said he starved himself. Others whispered of murder. The records do not speak plainly. A body was eventually shown, enough to prove he was no longer a threat, but the manner of death was left deliberately vague. Historians remain divided. Was it suicide, slow starvation, or an assassination disguised by secrecy? Regardless, the message was clear. A king could be unkinged, and once deposed, he could disappear entirely. Richard had once declared that kings were accountable only to God, but England had shown otherwise. And his fate became a precedent, that royalty could be revoked, not just in life, but in death. Because the next time someone tried to challenge that precedent, the crown responded with something even sharper than silence. Swift and public executions, arranged not for justice, but for memory. 18. The Epiphany Rising and Ruthless Reprisal. In the early weeks of 1400, a group of discontented nobles gathered quietly, their ambitions sharpened by a single treasonous thought. What if Richard II wasn't dead? Henry IV had been on the throne for less than 3 months. His rule, though accepted by Parliament, was fragile, resting on legal improvisation and political fatigue rather than deep-rooted loyalty. His claim was not uncontested, and the crown he wore still carried the heat of Richard's removal. Many believed Richard had been murdered, or worse for Henry, that he was still alive, hidden away in some distant castle, waiting to be restored. That whisper of possibility was all it took to spark the Epiphany Rising. Led by several high-ranking former courtiers of Richard, men who had once thrived under his favor, the plot was an act of desperation and loyalty combined. Their goal was theatrical and ambitious. Assassinate Henry IV during the Epiphany feast at Windsor Castle, restore Richard to the throne, and undo what they saw as a dangerous breach of the natural order. But things did not go according to plan. Whether through bad luck, loose lips, or quiet betrayal, the conspirators were discovered before they could act. Henry was warned in time and left Windsor before the assault. The rebellion, such as it was, collapsed before it even began. The crown had not just dodged a dagger, it now held the blade. What followed was not a restrained investigation. It was a message. Over the next several weeks, many of the rebels were hunted down, captured, and executed. There were no careful trials or lenient pardons. Reprisals were swift, public, and symbolic. Heads were displayed, estates confiscated, and names struck from official favor. The goal was clear: eliminate not just the plotters, but the idea that Richard's restoration was even possible. In the wake of the failed rising, Henry made one final move to seal the narrative. Word was released that Richard II had died, peacefully, in custody of natural causes. A body was displayed at St. Paul's Cathedral. Enough witnesses were brought in to confirm the identity, but not so many as to allow for questions. It was closure by decree. Whether Richard had truly died then or earlier is still debated. Some historians argue he may have been kept alive just long enough for the rebellion to fail, ensuring no rallying figure remained. Others believe the rising itself sealed his fate, prompting a quiet execution to prevent any further mythologizing. Either way, the Epiphany Rising left a deep scar. It revealed how unstable the idea of kingship had become, how a crown could be both worn and contested at once. It showed how memory, loyalty, and fear could combine into something combustible. And for Henry IV, it was a bitter lesson. The usurper must always look over his shoulder. Because if a king could be deposed, and a rumor could nearly restore him, then what happened? When the crown passed to someone entirely unfit to wear it, someone not betrayed by others but by his own mind? 19. The King Who Broke Down. By the time Henry VI inherited the English crown in 1422, he was 9 months old and already carrying the weight of two kingdoms. England and France were technically his. Reality, of course, was less cooperative. What followed was one of the most unsettling reigns in English history, not because of cruelty or ambition, but because the king himself slowly vanished while still alive. Henry VI grew up gentle, pious, and deeply unsuited to the ruthless mechanics of medieval rule. He disliked conflict, avoided confrontation, and believed, sincerely, that harmony could be achieved through prayer and goodwill. In a monastery, he would have thrived. On a throne surrounded by rival factions, he was exposed. For years, governance functioned through councils and powerful nobles acting in his name. That alone was dangerous. When a king does not rule, others inevitably do. Competing factions formed around figures like the Duke of York and the Duke of Somerset, each claiming to act in the king's best interest while quietly positioning themselves for dominance. Then, in 1453, the fragile illusion shattered. Henry suffered a severe mental collapse. Chroniclers describe him as unresponsive, unable to speak, unable to recognize his own son, born during this period and presented to him like a stranger. The king would sit motionless for hours, eyes open, mind absent. Government effectively stopped. England had a king who could not rule, could not decide, and could not even acknowledge the existence of his heir. This wasn't a brief episode. It lasted over a year. Modern historians are cautious about retroactive diagnosis, but most agree Henry experienced a profound psychological breakdown, possibly hereditary. His maternal grandfather, Charles VI of France, had suffered similar episodes, but medieval England had no concept of mental health and governance. A king was expected to rule by divine right. What happened when God's chosen ruler could no longer function? The answer was chaos. Parliament appointed Richard, Duke of York, as protector of the realm. Somerset was removed. Power shifted abruptly. When Henry recovered, suddenly, unpredictably, he reversed these decisions, reinstated his favorites, and reignited factional conflict. The result was political whiplash. No stability, no continuity, just uncertainty. This cycle repeated, Henry's condition recurred. Each episode weakened royal authority further. Nobles raised private armies. Allegiances hardened. What began as court rivalry turned into open warfare. By the late 1450s, England had slid into what would become the Wars of the Roses, red against white, Lancaster against York. And at the center of it all sat a king who neither wanted power nor could control those fighting for it. Henry wasn't cruel, he wasn't corrupt, he was tragically ill. And that made him dangerous, not through action, but through absence. His inability to rule created a vacuum that ambition rushed to fill. Eventually, he would be captured, released, restored, captured again. His crown would change hands. His fate would darken. Because when a king breaks, the crown doesn't disappear. It looks for someone stronger, and it rarely asks permission. And soon, Henry VI would learn that once power moves on without you, it doesn't come back gently. 20. A royal prisoner in the Tower. In the early 1460s, the Wars of the Roses were no longer a simmering political feud. They were a full-blown civil war with a revolving door of monarchs. Henry VI, the gentle, broken king, had been deposed by Edward IV in 1461 after a decisive Yorkist victory. But unlike other dethroned monarchs before him, Henry wasn't killed or exiled. He was kept, hidden, confined, and very much alive. Though how much of him remained present is a question no chronicler could quite answer. The Tower of London became his cage, though not immediately. For a time, Henry was moved across various castles under the watchful eye of Yorkist custodians. He was a living relic of a defeated dynasty, harmless on his own but dangerously symbolic. To Lancastrians, he was still the rightful king, God's anointed. To Edward IV, he was a liability in need of constant supervision. Then came 1470. After nearly a decade in hiding, Henry VI was abruptly restored to the throne, at least in name. The alliance between Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the so-called kingmaker, and Henry's exiled queen, Margaret of Anjou, forced Edward IV into temporary exile. For a brief, surreal period, the crown was placed back on Henry's head, but it was ceremonial at best. By this time, Henry was described by observers as frail, unresponsive, and largely incapable of independent speech. In one session of Parliament, he was reportedly led by the hand and stood silently as decisions were made around him. He was king again, but only as a placeholder for the ambitions of others. That restoration lasted less than a year. In 1471, Edward IV returned with force. He defeated and killed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, crushed Lancastrian forces at Tewkesbury, and captured Queen Margaret and her son, Prince Edward, extinguishing the immediate line of Lancastrian resistance. With no military threat left, Edward turned back to Henry, the man who had once been king, then prisoner, then king again. On May 21st, 1471, Henry VI died in the Tower. The official story? Natural causes, exacerbated by grief over the death of his son. Convenient, clean, and hard to disprove. But few believed it, even at the time. Chroniclers noted the suspicious timing, just hours after Edward IV re-entered London. And while the records are silent, the silence itself feels orchestrated. No witness accounts, no investigation. Just a death and a prompt burial at Chertsey Abbey, later moved to Windsor. Modern historians tend to agree. Henry VI likely didn't die of heartbreak. His death marked more than the end of a reign. It marked the final collapse of Lancastrian legitimacy, tidied up in a quiet room of stone walls and locked doors. A king once chosen by God, reduced to a logistical problem solved off the record. But if the Tower of London had claimed one king in the shadows, it wasn't finished. Because just a decade later, 2 royal children would enter its gates, young, crowned, and beloved, and never come back out. 21. A duke executed for being too dangerous. In 1478, the House of York turned on itself. The victim was George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother to King Edward IV and to the future Richard III, a man born dangerously close to power and even closer to ambition. George's downfall wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow, tangled descent shaped by entitlement, paranoia, and a chronic inability to pick the winning side. Once a golden prince, George had been elevated to high office, showered with land, and married off to the wealthy Isabel Neville, daughter of the Earl of Warwick, the same kingmaker who had helped Edward seize the throne. But George wanted more. He didn't just want to be close to the crown. He wanted to be a potential successor to it. When tensions rose between Edward IV and Warwick, George aligned with his father-in-law against his own brother. In 1470, during Edward's temporary exile, George even flirted with the idea of becoming king himself, backing the restoration of Henry VI, not out of loyalty, but as a stepping stone to his own ambitions. When Edward regained the throne, George was forgiven, at least publicly. But trust had evaporated. Over the next few years, George made himself impossible to ignore. He clashed with Queen Elizabeth Woodville's family, meddled in court politics, and, most disastrously, defied royal authority in a series of high-profile provocations. When his wife died in 1476, George's grief curdled into erratic behavior. He began accusing royal servants of treason, imprisoning one of them illegally, and even questioning the legitimacy of the royal succession. That was the final misstep. In early 1477, Edward IV had enough. Parliament was summoned, and George was arrested on charges of treason. The charges were vague, the evidence conveniently one-sided, and the trial, if one could call it that, was held privately, within the royal household. The outcome was never in doubt. George Plantagenet was executed in February 1478. The method? That's where the legend takes over. The story passed down through the centuries claims he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, a punishment so theatrical, so absurdly aristocratic, it feels almost too perfect to be true. Some contemporaries mentioned it. Most historians treat it with polite skepticism. But the exact method is, in the end, less important than the message. This wasn't justice. It was preemptive politics. George hadn't led a rebellion. He hadn't raised an army. He had simply become too unpredictable, too powerful, and too well connected to be tolerated. His death wasn't meant to end a civil war. It was meant to stop one before it started. But it didn't. Because power, once secured by violence, needs to keep feeding itself. And not long after George's execution, another pair of royals, this time even younger, even more innocent, would disappear into the same tower that had swallowed kings before them. This time the crown wouldn't even bother to explain. 22. The Princes in the Tower. In the summer of 1483, two boys were escorted into the Tower of London. One was 12, the newly proclaimed Edward Fee. The other, his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, aged 9. They were sons of the late King Edward IV, heirs to the House of York, and had been brought to the fortress supposedly for their own protection. Within weeks, they were declared illegitimate. Within months, they were never seen again. What happened in that tower is one of the most enduring mysteries of English history. It is not just a disappearance. It is a black hole in the historical record, a vanishing act at the center of a regime change. The story begins with the death of Edward IV in April 1483. His eldest son, Edward V, was meant to inherit the throne. But at just 12 years old, the boy was not prepared to rule alone. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, loyal brother to the late king, was named Lord Protector. The arrangement should have been temporary. It became permanent. Almost immediately, Richard began consolidating power. He arrested key members of the Woodville family, relatives of the Queen Mother and political rivals. He took custody of young Edward and moved him into the Tower, then still a royal residence as much as a prison. Soon after, young Richard joined his brother there. Then came the legal twist. A sermon was preached in London declaring that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. Their children, therefore, were illegitimate. Days later, Parliament issued the Titulus Regius, a formal declaration supporting the claim. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III. And the princes? Still in the Tower, still out of sight. Reports suggest they were seen playing in the gardens that summer. After that, nothing. No records, no funeral, no official statement. Just silence. Rumors spread quickly that they had been murdered, that they had been smothered in their beds, that Richard had ordered it, or perhaps someone else had, acting on perceived royal favor. Theories multiplied. Suspects expanded. Richard III, Henry Tudor, the Duke of Buckingham, all have been accused. All deny culpability by death or lack of evidence. Bones were discovered in 1674 beneath a staircase in the Tower. They were reburied at Westminster Abbey. In 1933, they were briefly examined but never conclusively identified. The truth, like the bodies, remains sealed in royal stone. Modern historians still debate the likely killer, but few doubt the outcome. The princes never left that tower alive. Their disappearance was not just a tragedy, it was a political necessity. The kind of vanishing act that clears a path to power with plausible deniability. Richard III reigned for just over 2 years before being killed at Bosworth by Henry Tudor, who then destroyed the Titulus Regius and married the prince's sister, Elizabeth of York. A neat dynastic knot tied over a grave no one could find. But being royal and innocent was never a shield. Just ask the teenage girl who reigned for 9 days, signed no orders, led no armies, and still found herself walking to the scaffold. 23. A queen branded a usurper and executed. In July of 1553, Lady Jane Grey became Queen of England. By August, she was a prisoner, and by February of the following year, she was dead. Executed not for anything she had done, but for who she was, what others made her represent, and how quickly the crown can devour its own. Jane was just 16, well-educated, devoutly Protestant, and politically irrelevant, until she wasn't. Her bloodline connected her to the Tudor dynasty as a great-granddaughter of Henry VII, placing her within striking distance of succession. But proximity to the throne, in Tudor England, was often less a privilege than a hazard. The real power play began as King Edward VI, Henry VIII's only legitimate son, approached death in 1553. Still a teenager himself, Edward was determined to prevent the crown from passing to his Catholic half-sister Mary. He and his council devised a plan: bypass both Mary and Elizabeth and name Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant, as his successor. Jane didn't seek the throne. According to later accounts, she fainted when she was told she would be queen. But she accepted, likely pressured by her ambitious father, the Duke of Suffolk, and her father-in-law, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who just happened to be the most powerful man in England and had recently married Jane to his son, Guilford. On July 10th, Jane was proclaimed queen. For 9 days, she reigned in name, signing documents and holding court while the country watched to see if the coup would stick. It didn't. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon and rightful heir under Henry VIII's will, raised an army and public support almost overnight. Towns declared for Mary. Nobles defected. The people, weary of elite manipulation, rallied behind the daughter of their former queen. By July 19th, the Privy Council had switched sides. Jane was arrested. Mary entered London to cheering crowds. What followed was a performance of mercy at first. Mary knew Jane had been a pawn. She kept her imprisoned in the Tower but showed initial signs of clemency. That changed after a Protestant rebellion in early 1554, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt. Though Jane had no involvement, her name still carried weight among dissenters. Mary, now preparing to marry Philip of Spain and unite with Catholic Europe, saw Jane as a risk she could no longer afford to keep alive. On February 12th, Lady Jane Grey was executed within the walls of the Tower. Reports say she died with grace and dignity, quoting scripture and expressing forgiveness. She had reigned for 9 days and paid with her life for every one of them. Jane's legacy is both haunting and instructive. She ruled nothing, commanded no army, and made no laws. But her bloodline, her faith, and the machinations of men placed her on the throne, and then beneath it. Her fall wasn't the last, because just a few years later, another royal claimant would rise from nowhere, claim to be someone long thought dead, and send the new Tudor regime scrambling for control. 24. The disappearing of a rival, Perkin Warbeck. In the 1490s, a young man appeared in the courts of Europe claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the infamous princes in the Tower, presumed dead since 1483. His name, at least publicly, was Perkin Warbeck. His story? That he had escaped murder, lived in hiding, and was now ready to reclaim his rightful place as heir to the English throne. For King Henry VII, this wasn't just an irritating rumor. It was a threat sharpened by the blade of legitimacy. Because whether Warbeck was truly Richard or not, and the overwhelming majority of historians agree he was not, the claim itself mattered more than the truth. England had just emerged from decades of civil war. The Tudor dynasty was new, fragile, and rooted in conquest rather than clear succession. Any plausible Yorkist claimant, real or manufactured, had the potential to unravel everything Henry had built. Warbeck's story was dangerously well received. European courts, especially those hostile to the Tudor regime, offered him recognition and support. Margaret of Burgundy, sister to Edward IV and a powerful Yorkist exile, welcomed him as her nephew. James IV of Scotland gave him military aid and married him to a Scottish noblewoman. Even the Holy Roman Emperor briefly entertained his cause. It was dynastic chaos, exported and franchised. Meanwhile, in England, the nobility was split between caution and quiet curiosity. The idea that one of the lost princes had survived and returned from the dead carried an almost mythic appeal. It allowed Yorkist loyalists to project their hopes onto a living figure, no matter how dubious the origins. Henry VII responded with a mixture of intelligence work, diplomacy, and increasingly ruthless crackdowns. He exposed Warbeck's movements, pressured foreign courts to abandon him, and eventually defeated an attempted landing in Cornwall in 1497. Warbeck surrendered. But the story didn't end there. Instead of immediate execution, Henry chose a slow dismantling. Warbeck was paraded through the streets of London, a living disproof of his own claim. He was imprisoned, then publicly confessed to being an impostor. But whether this was true confession or coerced performance is impossible to say. For a king interested in optics, the confession was the real weapon. Still, Warbeck remained dangerous. In 1499, after allegedly attempting to escape alongside Edward, Earl of Warwick, the last significant male Yorkist in captivity, Warbeck was executed. The message was clear. There would be no more false princes, no more whispers of alternative kings. The Tudor dynasty would not tolerate ghosts. But Perkin Warbeck didn't fade easily. His story continued to haunt Tudor politics, reappearing in plays, pamphlets, and rebellion. He had lived briefly as a royal, died as a traitor, and left behind a question that still lingers. What if he was who he claimed to be? And if that uncertainty could shake a crown, imagine the fear sparked by someone who definitely had royal blood, and just enough of a claim to threaten everything. A prince born of Yorkist blood, locked away, and soon tried in what looked less like justice and more like preemptive elimination. 25. A prince executed after a show trial. In 1499, Henry VII made a decision that revealed exactly how precarious he still believed his throne to be. After more than a decade as king, with a growing dynasty and a crown secured by law, marriage, and political maneuvering, he still saw one young man as too dangerous to live: Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick. Edward was the last legitimate male of the Yorkist line. The son of George, Duke of Clarence, himself executed years earlier for treason, Edward had been just a child when the Wars of the Roses ended. That didn't matter. His blood was a threat. His lineage, a living symbol of an alternative monarchy. So, shortly after Henry's victory at Bosworth in 1485, Edward was placed in the Tower of London. He was 10 years old. There he remained, largely forgotten by the public, but never by the crown. For 14 years, Edward lived in confinement, out of sight, out of power, but not out of danger. He was not accused of any crime. He was not given a role in court or society. His existence was the problem. His very presence complicated Henry's claim to legitimacy. The final pretext came, conveniently, with the arrival of Perkin Warbeck, the so-called pretender claiming to be Richard of York, one of the lost princes. In 1499, Warbeck and Edward were accused of conspiring to escape the tower. The story was neat, almost suspiciously so. Two potential claimants, conveniently caught in a plot that would justify their removal. Edward was swiftly tried and convicted of treason. Modern historians widely agree that this was not about justice. It was about necessity, at least as Henry VII understood it. The Tudor dynasty was still young, and Henry was in the middle of negotiating the marriage of his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon. A Spanish alliance required political stability. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain wanted assurances that no rival claimants lingered in England's royal dungeons. So, Edward was executed, quietly, formally, and with a minimum of fanfare. He was about 24. He had never led an army, never held power, never publicly rebelled. But he had the name, and that was enough. The execution left a mark. Even in his own time there were murmurs that the king had overreached, that this was not punishment, but preemption, that the prince had been sacrificed to secure an alliance and silence a bloodline. Henry, ever pragmatic, likely saw it differently. He had ended a war. He would not risk another for the sake of mercy. Edward Plantagenet's death was the closing of a chapter the Tudors could never quite erase, and his story was a grim reminder that royal blood, without royal favor, is as much a curse as a blessing. Especially if you were born a girl, young, royal, and married off before you understood the meaning of your own name. The crown didn't just gamble with thrones, it gambled with childhood. 26. Child marriage at the top, the little queen. In 1396, a marriage took place that baffled even the cynical chroniclers of medieval politics. Richard II, King of England, 30 years old and freshly widowed, married Isabella of Valois, a French princess. She was 6, not 16. 6. The union was not the product of scandal, romance, or even personal ambition. It was the result of diplomacy. England and France had been locked in conflict for decades, part of the grinding saga we now call the 100 Years' War. The marriage was designed as a peace offering, quite literally. Isabella came with a truce attached. In exchange for her hand, England and France agreed to a temporary halt in hostilities. No battles, no sieges, no honor lost. Just a treaty and a little girl in a crown. To Richard, this arrangement made sense. He had no heir and few allies. He was increasingly isolated, politically embattled, and in need of a gesture that looked like strength but cost him little: military capital. A royal marriage to the daughter of Charles VI of France, himself prone to episodes of mental instability, was a powerful symbol of continental harmony. To Isabella's family, it was pragmatic. She would be Queen of England, raised in luxury, watched over by a fleet of noble guardians. Her marriage would not be consummated until she was older, they assured themselves. In the meantime, she would be more political hostage than wife. And that's what she became. For all the poetic language surrounding royal unions, the reality was deeply transactional. Isabella was not treated cruelly, but neither was she allowed to be a child. She was kept under close watch, placed at the ceremonial center of court rituals and spoken of in diplomatic correspondence as a strategic asset. She had no say, no agency, and no understanding of the role history had assigned her. Then, in 1399, everything collapsed. Richard II was deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Isabella, barely 10 years old, was suddenly no longer queen, but still very much a French princess in enemy hands. To Henry's credit, she was treated with care. He even proposed marrying her to his own son, the future Henry V. But Isabella refused, or rather, her family refused on her behalf. By 1401, she was returned to France. 3 years later, at just 16, she was married again, this time to Charles, Duke of Orleans. She died in childbirth at the age of 19. Isabella's life wasn't a tragedy in the dramatic sense. It was a slow erosion, a royal girl caught between empires, spoken for by kings, and passed between courts like a living treaty. She never ruled. She never rebelled. She was simply used, first for peace, then for politics. And she wasn't alone. Another royal girl, born decades later, would be pushed into marriage even younger, forced to bear a child while still a child herself. Her name was Margaret Beaufort, and her story was darker still. 27. A mother of kings nearly killed by childbirth politics. In the winter of 1457, a girl named Margaret Beaufort gave birth to a son. She was 13 years old. The child, born in Pembroke Castle during a storm last January, was Henry Tudor, future King Henry VII. But in that moment, no one expected greatness. They were simply hoping the girl would survive. Margaret's body was not built for childbirth. Slight in stature and still in the early stages of adolescence, she had been married off at 12 to Edmund Tudor, a half-brother of King Henry VI. It was a strategic match, orchestrated not for love, but for bloodlines. Margaret descended from John of Gaunt, a son of Edward III, making her a Lancastrian prize in the game of dynastic politics. Edmund Tudor, in his mid-20s, didn't live to see the birth. He died of plague while imprisoned during the Wars of the Roses, leaving his young wife widowed and alone. That left Margaret to deliver a child at an age when most nobles were still being taught how to manage a household. Her labor was reportedly so traumatic that she never bore another child. The physical toll was permanent, but the political consequences were just beginning. As a childless widow with an infant son, Margaret's position was vulnerable. In theory, she held status as a great heiress. In practice, she was a teenage girl at the mercy of men who saw her as a conduit to royal blood. She was swiftly remarried, twice more before the age of 30. Each match brought new calculations, new alliances, and new risks. But Margaret was no passive figure. Over time, she transformed her limited agency into strategic mastery. She managed estates, cultivated alliances, and, most importantly, protected her son. Henry Tudor spent most of his youth in exile, dodging the violent back and forth of Yorkist and Lancastrian power struggles. Margaret couldn't shield him physically, but she never stopped planning for his return. When the opportunity finally came, after the disappearance of the princes in the Tower and the collapse of Richard III's popularity, Margaret was at the center of the plot. She helped arrange her son's invasion of England in 1485. She coordinated with disaffected nobles. She even promised her son would marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the two rival houses. It worked. Henry won at Bosworth. The Tudor dynasty was born. But the cost of that dynasty began with Margaret's own childhood, shaped by forced marriage, dangerous childbirth, and the constant need to maneuver within a court that viewed girls as reproductive assets and political bargaining chips. She became known as the King's Mother, a formidable matriarch who wore black, founded colleges, and sponsored scholars. But beneath the piety and patronage was a woman forged by necessity. And while Margaret carved power from the ruins of her girlhood, her son, once the object of fragile hope, would soon find himself at war with marriage itself, not to escape it, but to weaponize it. Because for Henry VIII, the crown wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a hammer to be used against heaven itself. 28. The Royal Divorce Machine. In the 1530s, Henry VIII took a personal crisis and turned it into a constitutional rupture. What began as a marital dispute became a redefinition of monarchy, religion, and the law itself. The story of Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon is often told as a tale of love versus duty, or lust versus doctrine. But at its heart, it was about control, not just over a marriage, but over everything: the church, the succession, and the souls of his subjects. Catherine of Aragon had been queen for over 20 years. She was popular, pious, and dignified, but she had failed in Henry's eyes at one essential task: providing a surviving male heir. Their only living child was Mary, a daughter, and that was not enough. Henry, aging and increasingly anxious about legacy, convinced himself, through scripture, scholars, and sleepless nights, that his marriage was not just unhappy, but unlawful in the eyes of God. The problem? The Pope disagreed. For years, Henry petitioned Rome for an annulment, arguing that marrying his brother's widow had cursed the union. But Catherine refused to step aside, insisting her marriage to Henry's brother Arthur had never been consummated. The Pope, caught between English pressure and Spanish politics, Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, delayed, hedged, and ultimately denied the request. So Henry made a decision. If the church wouldn't give him the answer he wanted, he would become the church, or at least the part of it that mattered in England. What followed was one of the most radical legal and theological shifts in English history. Henry broke from Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and pushed through a series of parliamentary acts that gave royal proclamations the force of divine law. The crown was now above the Pope, above tradition, even above Scripture, at least in Henry's version of the hierarchy. The annulment was granted by English clergy under royal pressure. Catherine was cast aside, her daughter Mary declared illegitimate. Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry had pursued for nearly a decade, was crowned queen. The Tudor court had reinvented itself not with swords, but with statutes. But the cost was enormous. Clergymen who resisted were executed or exiled. Monasteries were dissolved. Royal loyalty was redefined as submission to the king's spiritual supremacy. The line between heresy and treason blurred to the point of irrelevance. Dissent, even in private, became a capital offense. This wasn't just a king following his heart. It was a ruler reconfiguring the machinery of the state to meet a personal demand. And once the machine was built, it didn't stop. Henry would marry 5 more times, execute 2 of his wives, and leave behind a kingdom bruised by religious whiplash. But Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom the church had been reimagined, would find no security in her new crown. Because soon, the same system that made her queen would turn against her, swiftly, brutally, and without warning. 29. A queen put on trial and executed. In 1536, just 3 years after Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church to marry her, Anne Boleyn was arrested, charged with treason, and publicly executed. It was the first time in English history that a crowned queen had been put on trial, and the outcome was not only a personal catastrophe, but a national reckoning. The woman for whom a kingdom had changed its religion was now accused of plotting its ruin. Anne's rise had been meteoric. As lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, she caught Henry's eye, not with submissive charm, but with wit, intelligence, and defiance. She wasn't content to be a mistress. She demanded marriage. And eventually, she got it, along with a crown, a coronation, and the wrath of half of Europe. But by 1536, the glow had dimmed. Anne had failed to produce a surviving male heir. Her only living child was a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry, ever anxious about dynastic security, began to drift. Jane Seymour, a new lady-in-waiting, appeared at court, and with her, the possibility of a fresh start. Then, As if overnight, Anne's position collapsed. In May, she was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The charges were staggering: adultery with multiple men, incest with her own brother, conspiracy against the king's life. It was a catalogue of allegations so extreme that even some of Henry's own allies raised eyebrows. The accused men were arrested, tortured, and coerced. Anne was tried by a panel of nobles, many of whom owed their fortunes to the king's favor. The trial was a performance. Evidence was thin. Dates were implausible. Witnesses were unreliable. But the verdict had already been written in the king's mind. Guilty. Not just of betrayal, but of being inconvenient. Modern historians widely agree that Anne was framed. Whether it was the work of Thomas Cromwell, seeking to protect his position, or simply Henry's growing desire to be rid of her, the trial was less about justice and more about permission. Permission to erase, replace, and move forward. Anne met her end on May 19, 1536. She was granted the mercy of a French swordsman instead of an axe. In her final speech, she praised the king, forgave her enemies, and maintained her dignity, an ironic grace given the system that had destroyed her. Within days, Henry was engaged to Jane Seymour. Within weeks, they were married. Within a year, she gave him the son Anne never had. But Anne Boleyn left something behind that no one expected to matter: her daughter, Elizabeth. And while Anne's name was blackened, her daughter would one day inherit the throne and change the world. Still, the lesson was brutal. In Henry's court, favor was conditional, loyalty was disposable, and even queens could be brought down by whispers in corridors. And for one of his later wives, a girl barely past childhood, those whispers would soon become a death sentence of her own. 30. A teenage queen executed after adultery charges. In 1542, just 6 years after Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry VIII sent another wife to the scaffold, Catherine Howard, a teenage girl whose brief reign as queen ended with accusations of infidelity, betrayal, and the same cold machinery of state that had consumed her cousin before her. Catherine Howard was young, likely in her mid-teens, when she married Henry, who by then was nearly 50, overweight, and suffering from chronic health issues. She was his fifth wife, brought to court after the death of Jane Seymour and the brief, politically awkward marriage to Anne of Cleves. Catherine was lively, charming, and to Henry, a symbol of youth and renewal. He called her his rose without a thorn. She called him her sweet king. It was, on the surface, a fairy tale. But beneath the flattery, there were secrets, dangerous ones. Before her marriage, Catherine had lived in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where supervision was loose and propriety looser. There, as later investigations revealed, she had formed relationships with men, most notably a music tutor named Henry Mannix and a courtier, Francis Derham. These early encounters, while not unusual for a young noblewoman, would later be reinterpreted as damning evidence of moral unfitness. After becoming queen, Catherine allegedly began a new relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a favored courtier. The nature of that relationship remains debated. Was it an affair? Was it flirtation magnified by gossip? Or was it something darker, tangled in coercion and hierarchy? We don't know. What we do know is that someone told the king. In late 1541, rumors began circulating. Archbishop Cranmer presented evidence to Henry, who reportedly refused to believe it at first, but soon interrogations began. Derham and Culpeper were arrested, tortured, and eventually executed. Catherine, detained at Hampton Court, was accused of treason through adultery. Unlike Anne Boleyn's dramatic trial, Catherine's fall unfolded more slowly, more silently. She was never granted a formal trial. Her confession, likely extracted under pressure, was enough. Parliament passed a bill of attainder, declaring her guilty without need for further evidence. On February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London. She was perhaps 19. According to some reports, She practiced placing her head on the block the night before. On the scaffold, she spoke briefly, expressing regret, asking for mercy on her soul, and meeting her death with composure. Her story would quickly be overshadowed by the next chapter in Henry's tumultuous reign. Yet Catherine's downfall revealed much about the system she entered. She had little power, less experience, and no protection. Married into a throne where affection was political and virtue a weapon, she was consumed by the same crown that had lifted her up, and while Henry moved on, England itself was shifting, because behind palace walls something larger was crumbling, not just queens, but monasteries, shrines, entire religious orders. The kingdom's soul was being repossessed. 31. The disappearing bodies of the dissolution. Between 1536 and 1541, England underwent one of the most seismic and unsettling transformations in its history, not through war, rebellion, or foreign invasion, but through paperwork and royal decree. The dissolution of the monasteries, as it would later be called, was Henry VIII's systematic dismantling of centuries-old religious institutions across the realm. In theory, it was about reform. In reality, it was about power, property, and the quiet erasure of an entire way of life. At the start of Henry's reign, England was home to over 800 monastic houses, abbeys, priories, nunneries, each one part of a vast network of land, learning, and spiritual labor. These institutions owned nearly a third of the nation's land. They cared for the sick, educated the young, fed the poor, and offered sanctuary to those in need. But they also reported to Rome, and in a newly independent Church of England, that was no longer acceptable. Though official justification was corruption. Royal commissioners were dispatched to inspect monasteries, and they returned with damning reports, real, exaggerated, and sometimes entirely fabricated. They described idleness, superstition, mismanagement. These accounts were compiled, printed, and used to justify dissolution under new parliamentary acts. But while some abuses certainly existed, no institution is free from fault. The broader goal was unmistakable: break the influence of the Catholic Church and absorb its wealth into the crown. The process began with smaller houses, those earning less than $200 a year. These were closed with relative ease. But soon, the closures expanded. Larger abbeys, revered sites like Glastonbury and fountains, were seized. Monks and nuns were pensioned off, forced into lay life, or, in some cases, arrested for resistance. The buildings were stripped of their assets: gold, silver, altar cloths, books, relics. Stone was carted off for other uses. Roofs collapsed. Libraries burned or scattered. Cemeteries were plundered. Generations of memory dissolved, not with violence, but with cold administrative efficiency. Henry, naturally, profited. The land was sold or gifted to loyal nobles, creating a new ruling class enriched by the spoils of religion. The crown's finances were temporarily bolstered. Royal authority, once shadowed by monastic independence, now reigned unchallenged. But the cost was profound. Entire communities lost their spiritual centers. Monks and nuns, many of whom had known no other life, were left adrift. Pilgrimage routes vanished. Almsgiving collapsed. England's religious landscape was stripped bare, and in its place stood something newer, harder, more transactional. To the monarchy, it was progress, centralization, consolidation, reform. To many others, it felt like cultural hollowing, the quiet disappearance of things once thought eternal. And the king? He had made himself head of both church and state, but the appetite for control didn't end with institutions. Because if bricks and relics could be erased, so too could people. And even a boy king, barely old enough to rule, would preside over a kingdom where reform came with a sharpened edge, where doctrine, like loyalty, was enforced by law and enforced with finality. 32. A boy king's regime executes religion. When Edward VI ascended the throne in 1547, he was just 9 years old, too young to command armies, debate theology, or even sign his own royal decrees without help, but not too young, it turned out, to lead a revolution in faith, or rather, to be the figurehead of one. Because under Edward's name, a Protestant transformation swept through England with a speed and severity that stunned even seasoned observers. And behind the boy sat the men who wielded true power: regents, counselors, reformers, eager to reshape the soul of the kingdom. The England Edward inherited was already shaken. Henry VIII's break from Rome had severed ties with the papacy, but had left many Catholic practices intact. Latin Mass, clerical vestments, elaborate ritual. They persisted under the watch of a monarch who, despite his theological flirtations, remained fundamentally conservative. But Edward's regime, unburdened by that caution, moved quickly to tear up what remained. First came the language. Latin liturgies were replaced with English. The 1549 Book of Common Prayer, authored by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, standardized Protestant worship and stripped it of its more mystical and sacramental elements. Saints' days vanished. Religious images were whitewashed. The Mass itself was reinterpreted, transformed from sacrificial rite to symbolic commemoration. Next came the laws. Under Edward, a series of royal proclamations and parliamentary acts criminalized resistance. Clergy who refused the new rites were removed. Churches that clung to superstition were fined, closed, or worse. Dissent was not framed as theological disagreement. It was treasonous obstruction. Heresy had flipped its polarity. Where once it was dangerous to deny papal supremacy, now it was dangerous to defend it. But perhaps most unsettling was the speed. The shift from medieval Catholicism to Protestant reform didn't unfold slowly over generations. It happened in months. And it happened under the authority of a monarch who still needed a tutor to teach him Latin verbs. To many ordinary people, the change was confusing, even frightening. Parishioners watched as familiar altars were smashed, vestments vanished, and the music of worship fell silent. The dead were no longer prayed for. The Virgin Mary faded from stained glass. Even the rhythm of the calendar changed. These weren't just reforms. They were upheavals of memory and meaning. Edward himself was reportedly devout, even zealous. He read scripture, endorsed sermons, and showed every sign of internalizing the version of Protestantism handed to him by his guardians. But it was always clear who set the direction. Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Power brokers in clerical robes. Still, the religious reforms under Edward VI weren't just doctrinal, they were disciplinary. The new faith came with rules, and those rules came with punishments. Even those who had survived Henry's reign now found themselves under suspicion. Because in this New England, shaped by scripture and sharpened by politics, mercy was optional. And when the tide turned again, when Edward died young, without heirs, it would fall to his sister to decide whether the country's soul had been reformed or defiled. She chose fire. 33. Mary I and the Burnings. When Mary I came to the throne in 1553, she inherited a country already pulled apart by 2 decades of religious turmoil. Her father had broken from Rome. Her brother's council had dismantled the Catholic liturgy piece by piece. And now, as England's first crowned queen regnant, and a devout Catholic, Mary was determined to reverse it all. Not quietly, not gradually, but completely. For her, this wasn't politics. It was salvation. The country had lost its way. Her father's breach with Rome was, in her eyes, a sin against divine order. Her brother's reforms, blasphemy. Mary believed that true religion could not be allowed to coexist with heresy. It had to replace it. And she had both the crown and the conviction to make that happen. In 1554, she reinstated papal authority in England. Mass returned in Latin. The old rituals were revived. Former Catholic bishops were restored to their positions. And Parliament, perhaps surprisingly, didn't resist. They passed the laws. They repealed Edwardian reforms. But then came the question of enforcement, and Mary's answer would become her legacy. Between 1555 and 1558, more than 280 people were burned at the stake for heresy. These were not war criminals or seditious plotters. They were Protestant preachers, lay believers, former clergy, people who refused to recant their beliefs and submit to the restored Catholic Church. The executions were public, highly visible, and framed by the crown as necessary purification. The policy was legal, sanctioned by Parliament, and carried out through the church courts. But the symbolism went far beyond law. The fires of Smithfield and Oxford became markers of ideological victory or loss, depending on where one stood. Among those executed were some of the most prominent Protestant thinkers of the day: Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. Their deaths, far from silencing dissent, turned them into martyrs. The spectacle of aged men, scholars, and bishops, tied to posts and condemned by the very state they had once served, planted seeds of opposition that would bloom long after Mary's reign. Mary, for her part, saw herself as a shepherd restoring a straying flock. She reportedly wept at news of executions, but never altered course. The burnings, she believed, were necessary medicine. England would be saved through suffering, rebaptized through flame. But the public mood shifted. Even those unsure of Protestant theology began to question the policy. Was this the price of orthodoxy? And what exactly was being preserved, faith or control? By the time Mary died in 1558, she had failed to produce an heir, and her efforts to restore Catholicism were already unraveling. Her half-sister, Elizabeth, would inherit the throne and take the country in a different direction. Again. Still, Mary's reign left its mark. To some, she was a defender of the old faith. To others, she became Bloody Mary, a name she never lived to hear, but one that would follow her forever. Because the next queen wouldn't burn as many people. She'd simply make treason a matter of opinion. 34. Elizabeth's reign and the machinery of treason. When Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, she inherited a kingdom exhausted by religious whiplash. Her father had built a personal church, her brother had stripped it to its bones, and her sister had tried to set it ablaze. By the time Elizabeth appeared, England was less a nation of believers than a country of survivors, quietly adjusting, nodding in public, keeping their real convictions behind closed doors. Elizabeth understood the landscape. She was, after all, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman whose very marriage had triggered the break with Rome. Her legitimacy was still contested by many Catholic powers. The Pope had declared her a heretic. Plots brewed. Assassins were rumored. Foreign invasion was more than a whisper. So while Elizabeth marketed herself as the Virgin Queen, serene and above faction, her government became something else entirely. A highly efficient system for monitoring, managing, and when necessary, eliminating threats. Under her reign, treason became elastic. Refusing to attend Anglican services, recusancy, was punishable by heavy fines. Harboring a Catholic priest could be a death sentence. Saying Mass in secret could bring the Tower. The walls had ears, and those ears reported to William Cecil and Francis Walsingham, two of the most calculating intelligence minds of the age. They built a surveillance state in all but name. Codebreakers intercepted letters. Agents infiltrated foreign courts. Spies embedded in households. Printing presses were raided. Networks of informants tracked whispers and rumors like royal currency. Elizabeth didn't need to see everything. She had men who did it for her, quietly, ruthlessly, and with full legal backing. And the law itself? It was always expanding. The Treasons Act of 1571 made it punishable to deny Elizabeth's legitimacy or suggest someone else had a better claim. The definition of sedition could include a pamphlet, a sermon, even a conversation in the wrong company. The crown learned from Mary's mistakes. Less fire, more fear. Less spectacle, more silence. Yet even within this tightening noose, real plots did exist. The Northern Rebellion of 1569, the Ridolfi plot in 1571, the Throckmorton plot in 1583, and finally, the Babington plot in 1586. A conspiracy that would finally give the government what it needed to eliminate the greatest perceived threat of all, Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth hesitated. She knew what it meant to execute an anointed queen, especially one who was her cousin. But the machinery she had allowed to grow beneath her eventually cornered her into signing the warrant. Mary was beheaded in 1587. It was both an end and a beginning. A warning to enemies. A message to subjects. A precedent for power over blood. Elizabeth's reign is often remembered for golden ages and naval victories, but beneath the poetry and portraits was a darker achievement, the crafting of a modern surveillance state before the term existed, where belief was tolerated only if it was quiet, and where speaking out could mean disappearing in full daylight. Because in Tudor England, treason didn't need to be true. It only needed to be believed by the right people. 35. The execution of a queen cousin. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, former monarch, political exile, and Elizabeth I's cousin, was executed on English soil. The event was momentous, the first time in English history that a sovereign queen, anointed by God and crowned in her own right, was legally executed by the government of another monarch. And while the act was wrapped in legal justification and framed as national security, its implications went far beyond the scaffold. Mary Stuart had always been a problem. From the moment she arrived in England in 1568, fleeing rebellion in Scotland, she brought with her something no government could ignore: a claim. To Catholics across Europe, Elizabeth was illegitimate, born of a marriage never recognized by Rome. Mary, in contrast, was descended from Henry VII through Margaret Tudor and had married into French royalty before returning to rule Scotland. She was Catholic, widowed, politically dangerous, and most threatening of all, fertile. Elizabeth had no children. Mary did. That alone made her a magnet for plots, real and imagined. For nearly 2 decades, Mary was held in luxurious confinement. Her presence in England sparked countless conspiracies, most notably the Ridolfi, Throckmorton, and Babington plots, all of which aimed to remove Elizabeth and replace her with Mary. Walsingham's growing network of spies intercepted letters, cracked ciphers, and used entrapment as policy. Mary's rooms were watched, her correspondence monitored, her servants bribed or coerced. The walls whispered back to the crown. Eventually, in 1586, the Babington plot provided what Elizabeth's ministers had been waiting for: written evidence, however questionable in origin, that Mary had agreed to support the assassination of Elizabeth and take the crown. That letter, decoded and delivered to the Privy Council, was enough. Mary was put on trial, a queen judged by the state of a queen. She denied the charges, but the process was political theater. The outcome, as ever, had been preordained. Elizabeth agonized publicly over the decision, but signed the execution warrant nonetheless. Then, in a final act of plausible deniability, she blamed her secretary for dispatching it too quickly. On February 8, 1587, Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. Her final moments were documented in excruciating detail by witnesses: her dress, her composure, her words. She died defiantly, claiming martyrdom. Her servants wept. Her enemies took note. Her son, James VI of Scotland, waited. He did not declare war. The execution removed a threat but raised a new question. If queens could be judged and executed by other monarchs, what was the meaning of divine right? The sanctity of royal blood had cracked. The scaffold had reached the throne. Elizabeth would rule for another 16 years. She would never name a successor. But when she died, it was Mary's son who would inherit her kingdom, without a fight, without a coup, without a drop of blood. Because sometimes the dead inherit power more effectively than the living. And sometimes the crown forgets who's watching, until a favorite turns and makes a bid for glory. 36. Royal image versus private reality. The Earl of Essex. In 1601, the streets of London stirred with whispers and soldiers as Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, once the golden boy of Elizabeth I's court, marched into the city with a desperate dream, to seize control of the royal court and perhaps the crown itself. Hours later, his rebellion collapsed in confusion. Days later, he was tried for treason. Weeks later, he was dead. But Essex's fall wasn't just the end of an ambitious noble. It was a cautionary tale about what happens when the crown's image becomes more important than its relationships, when favor replaces trust, and power is measured in proximity to the monarch's smile. Robert Devereux wasn't born into rebellion, he was born into favor. His stepfather, Robert Dudley, the Queen's longtime favorite, helped smooth his way into court. Young, handsome, educated, and bold, Essex caught Elizabeth's attention at a time when flattery still had currency. He became a trusted commander, a privy councillor, and, at least publicly, a loyal subject. But his rise came with edges. He was impulsive, proud, and increasingly unwilling to play the obedient courtier. He wanted to be more than a favorite. He wanted to be a kingmaker, or possibly more. At court, Essex's brashness clashed with seasoned statesmen like William Cecil and Francis Bacon. He grew frustrated with compromise. Abroad, he sought glory. His 1596 raid on Cadiz was a bold success. But his 1599 campaign in Ireland, meant to crush a rebellion, ended in failure and a dangerous breach of protocol. Disobeying direct orders, Essex returned to court uninvited, burst into the Queen's private chambers, and demanded explanation, apology, or power. He got none. Elizabeth, nearing 70 and increasingly surrounded by men who had grown cautious with age and experience, was not about to tolerate a loud, impatient challenge to her authority. Essex was placed under house arrest. His monopoly privileges were revoked. His star, once ascendant, began to fall, publicly. That's when the fantasy set in. Essex began to imagine a coup, or at least a purge. He believed his enemies had poisoned the Queen's mind. If only he could reach her directly, show her the truth, she would restore him. But by this point, it wasn't just about restoration. It was about survival. So in February 1601, he tried to seize control of London. He called on allies. He urged the people to rise. They did not. The rebellion was over in less than a day. His supporters scattered. The crown moved quickly. Essex was arrested, interrogated, and put on trial. He begged for mercy. He named names. And in the end, he faced execution with far less grandeur than he had once imagined. Elizabeth reportedly took the sentence hard. She did not attend the execution. She spoke of him often in the months that followed. But by then, her own image was the only part of her rule that remained untouchable. And not even that would be safe when her successor arrived, one obsessed with witches, omens, and unseen enemies hiding in plain sight. 37. A king obsessed with witches. Law as fear. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, he brought with him more than just a new royal bloodline. He brought his fears, deep ones, supernatural ones, and he had the paperwork to prove it. Unlike Elizabeth, who had largely treated witch trials as provincial sideshows, James was personally interested in the subject, very interested. He saw witchcraft not just as a crime, but as an existential threat to the crown itself, a covert war waged by invisible agents of the devil. And if that sounds theatrical, that's because it was. James saw the world as a kind of courtroom drama, with himself as both prosecutor and potential victim. His obsession had roots. In 1590, while still King of Scotland, James and his new wife, Anne of Denmark, experienced a terrifying storm while sailing home. Not long after, local witch trials in North Berwick began to name names. Some confessed, under methods best left undescribed, to conspiring to raise storms and harm the royal couple. One woman, Agnes Sampson, was accused of reciting private details about the king's wedding night, supposedly obtained through sorcery. James was captivated. He didn't just approve the prosecutions, he got involved. By 1597, he had written a book, Daemonology. It was part theological treatise, part instruction manual, and entirely serious. He argued that witches were real, dangerous, and deserved harsh punishment. When he took the English throne, that mindset followed. In 1604, Parliament passed a new Witchcraft Act. More expansive than previous versions, it made it a capital offense to invoke evil spirits or enter into a pact with the devil. The law gave wide latitude to local magistrates and encouraged confession-based justice. England had seen witch trials before, but now the king himself had sanctified the process. And so the hunts began, not in courtly chambers, but in remote villages, windswept towns, and anxious parishes. Accusations flew over livestock deaths, unexplained illnesses, or simple neighborly resentment. Those accused were often women, often poor, and almost always powerless. The trials were not centrally coordinated, but the king's belief gave them legitimacy. James didn't invent witch trials, but he amplified them. He gave them intellectual cover. He made them fashionable in court and acceptable in politics. Even later, when he grew more skeptical of certain cases, the tone had been set. Fear of witches was now tied to loyalty to the crown. To question one could be to question the other. His reign marked a transitional moment, the merging of supernatural paranoia with state authority. Where the unseen wasn't dismissed, it was prosecuted. And if witches were enemies of the king, then any misfortune could be recast as treason in disguise. It wasn't just about fear, it was about control. And as James's government settled in, another kind of invisible threat was brewing. This one not in spellbooks but in barrels, hidden below Parliament, waiting quietly to explode. 38. Gunpowder Plot. Fallout, wider repression. When the gunpowder plot was uncovered in November 1605, it seemed like something out of a morality play. An apocalyptic scheme, a secret tunnel, barrels of gunpowder hidden beneath the House of Lords, and a man named Guy Fawkes caught red-handed with a slow match in the dark. The timing was perfect. Parliament was set to open the next day. King James I, his family, his council, wiped out in a single blast. The conspirators were Catholics. And that one fact was enough to set the tone for what followed. Not just justice, but a wave of calculated paranoia that would shape English policy for decades. The plot's failure was treated as divine intervention. Public prayers were ordered. Bonfires lit across the country. Parliament declared November 5th a day of national thanksgiving. Every year, forever. A failed bombing had instantly become a national ritual. But while the country celebrated, the government got to work. The state now had the perfect excuse to formalize what had been unofficial, deep suspicion of Catholic subjects. And this time, it wasn't just about faith, it was about national survival. In the years that followed, recusancy fines, the financial penalties for not attending Anglican services, were ramped up dramatically. Catholic property could be seized. The right to hold office, vote, or serve in Parliament was stripped away. Catholic education was banned. Catholic priests already under threat were now actively hunted. And while some officials distinguished between quiet Catholics and seditious ones, the law increasingly did not. What mattered wasn't what people believed in private. It was whether the state believed they posed a threat. That line, always shifting, became the real danger. And there was another layer, one rarely talked about in the grand national narrative. Protestant loyalty itself became performative. Participation in Anglican rituals, denunciation of the plot, celebration of the king's survival. These weren't just religious acts. They were political ones. To abstain from them, or to do them half-heartedly, was to invite suspicion. The irony, of course, was that most English Catholics had nothing to do with the plot. Many had hoped James would be more tolerant than Elizabeth, especially since his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had died a Catholic. But the plot poisoned that possibility. Tolerance was rebranded as recklessness. Leniency became betrayal. And so, for the average Catholic in England, the next several decades would mean living in the margins, always visible, never quite trusted. The gunpowder plot had failed, but its real success was in how it shifted the balance of fear, not just in the halls of government, but in the homes of ordinary people. Everyone was watching everyone else. And loyalty wasn't measured by peace, it was measured by performance. Because in James's England, you didn't have to light a fuse to be considered dangerous. You just had to be the wrong person in the wrong church at the wrong time. And for the king himself, that paranoia would only deepen, especially when his queen's foreign household brought whispers of intrigue right into the royal bedroom. 39. A royal marriage that became a political nightmare. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England, he arrived with baggage, some of it literal, dragged through the damp countryside by a royal entourage, some of it dynastic, courtesy of the Tudor succession crisis, and some of it diplomatic, stitched into the elegant gowns and whispered prayers of his queen, Henrietta Maria of France. A Catholic queen in a Protestant kingdom was always going to be a problem, but James had already made that choice earlier in life. His actual queen was Anne of Denmark, Protestant by birth, theatrical by temperament, and quietly complicated in her own right. Still, even that earlier marriage had already shown James something critical. Royal marriages weren't just domestic arrangements. They were public performances, political contracts, and most of all, national symbols, which made the union of Charles I and Henrietta Maria a powder keg with a wedding band. Charles, son of James, son of, inherited both the throne and his father's tendency to overestimate royal authority. In 1625, he married Henrietta Maria by proxy in France. She didn't even meet him until after the contract was sealed. The alliance was meant to secure peace with Catholic France and offer stability at home. It did neither. Henrietta Maria's presence in England quickly turned into a political liability. She was young, French, and unapologetically Catholic in a court that already viewed popery as a kind of political contagion. She brought her own chaplains, her own confessor, her own attendants, many of whom spoke little English and practiced a faith outlawed by Parliament. To the English public, she wasn't just a foreign queen, she was a walking provocation. And yet, Charles adored her. Their early marriage was strained, but over time it grew into one of the few truly affectionate royal partnerships of the era. That bond, however, only deepened the suspicions. Henrietta was seen as having influence over policy. Her Catholicism was blamed for Charles's perceived softness on religious conformity. In pamphlets, sermons, and whispered street gossip, she became the queen behind the king's most dangerous decisions. By the 1630s, England was tense. Parliament had been dismissed. Religious reforms pushed by Archbishop Laud were viewed as crypto-Catholic. Taxes were levied without consent. And all the while, the Queen's Catholic household remained in the heart of court, untouchable, and to many, intolerable. When civil war finally erupted in 1642, Henrietta was already in exile, raising money and troops in the Netherlands. Her involvement wasn't subtle. She was writing letters, negotiating arms deals, and calling in favors from her French relatives. Parliament declared her an enemy. Royalist supporters called her the king's backbone. Both were right. In a conflict framed as Protestant liberty versus royal tyranny, Henrietta Maria became a symbol no one could ignore. Queen consort whose religion, nationality, and influence were all painted as existential threats to English identity. And as Charles's grip on power weakened, it became clear that the war wasn't just about Parliament or taxes. It was about whether a king could still rule by divine right, when the people no longer believed he spoke for God. And soon, they would put that belief on trial, in public, under oath, with a verdict written in silence. 40. Civil War justice, executing a king. On a cold morning in January 1649, England did something that still echoes like a cannon blast through history. It killed its king. Charles I, divinely anointed, ruler by birthright, defender of the faith, or so the traditional script went, was led to a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. He wore 2 shirts, not for vanity, but to keep from visibly shivering in the cold. He didn't want the crowd to mistake trembling for fear. The optics mattered, even at the end. But this wasn't a sudden tragedy. It was the slow, deliberate conclusion of years of war, suspicion, and stubbornness. For over 2 decades, Charles had governed with the belief that kings answered only to God. Parliament, he believed, existed to serve, not to restrain. When they challenged his policies, he dismissed them. When they denied him funds, he found workarounds. When they demanded accountability, he shut the door. And when civil war came, he still believed he would win. He didn't. 3 civil wars later, England was a country exhausted by its own refusal to compromise. The parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell and other Puritan hardliners, had captured the king, tried negotiating, and watched him double deal behind the scenes. By 1648, patience had evaporated. Talks were ended. The army purged Parliament of moderates in what became known as Pride's Purge. What was left, barely a rump of the original house, voted to put the king on trial. There was no precedent. Kings weren't tried. They weren't questioned. They were buried eventually, but never judged by their own subjects. So the trial was controversial from the start. Many lawyers refused to participate. Judges declined appointments. Even the indictment itself danced around legitimacy, focusing instead on Charles as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy. His refusal to recognize the court's authority only made the proceedings more surreal. He never entered a plea. To him, the entire structure was illegal. To his accusers, that only confirmed his guilt. The verdict was predetermined. On January 27, 1649, Charles I was sentenced to death. 3 days later, the sentence was carried out. The execution shocked Europe. Monarchs watched nervously. Was this a one-off act of radical English madness, or a warning? Could kings be held accountable by the governed? Or was this simply regicide wrapped in legal parchment? In England, reactions were mixed. Some wept, others cheered. Many stayed silent. The monarchy was abolished. The House of Lords dissolved. England, at least for a moment, became a republic. The king's blood was said to stain the scaffold, and, in more poetic tellings, the conscience of the realm. But republics are delicate things, and revolutions don't always know what to do with victory. In the years to come, the crown would return, the monarchy would be restored, and Charles's son would ascend as Charles II. But the memory of that January morning would remain like a crack in the foundation, permanent, visible, and never quite patched over. Because once a crown is removed by axe instead of succession, it never sits quite the same again. And when it did return, the palace glittered. But beneath the surface, exploitation flourished in silk and candlelight. 41. Restoration Court. Exploitation behind the glitter. When Charles II returned to England in 1660, it was as if history had decided to throw a lavish party to forget the hangover. Banners fluttered. Bells rang. The son of the executed king swept into London not with vengeance, but with velvet, laughter, and a studied charm. The nation, exhausted by civil war, Puritan austerity, and years of Republican experiments, welcomed him like a cure they didn't quite trust but desperately wanted to believe in. And Charles knew it. He styled himself as the merry monarch, all wit and tolerance, cigars and spaniels. His court reflected that persona, a carnival of art, theater, music, and fashion. But like most carnivals, it came with masks, illusions, and shadows. Behind the brocade and powdered wigs, the Restoration Court was a brutal market of ambition. Power moved not just through politics, but through intimacy. Titles were won in bedchambers. Influence traded over whispered, promises and protection was bought with loyalty, or something that looked like it. At the center of this spectacle were the king's mistresses. Charles had many, some were well known. Barbara Villiers, Nell Gwynn, Louise de Querouaille. They came from different classes, noblewomen, actresses, courtiers, but what they shared was proximity to the throne. That made them both powerful and vulnerable. For some, elevation brought wealth, land, and noble titles. For others, it brought scandal, scrutiny, and quick dismissal when the political winds shifted. These weren't fairy tale romances. They were often calculated relationships, brokered in backrooms or offered up by ambitious families eager for royal favor. For young women at court, the line between advancement and exploitation blurred. Consent in a world so shaped by power imbalances became hard to define and harder to refuse. Charles didn't hide these relationships. He flaunted them. His illegitimate children were given dukedoms and estates. The Queen, Catherine of Braganza, remained childless and largely sidelined. The message was clear. Lineage could be informal, legitimacy negotiable, and public morality an outdated costume. Court life imitated the king. Favoritism became currency. Gossip became weaponry. Patronage replaced principle. And beneath the glittering surface, many lives were quietly shaped or shattered by the whims of access. Some historians have framed this era as refreshingly open compared to the repression of the Puritan Commonwealth. And to a degree it was. But the Restoration was less a liberation than a substitution. Instead of dogma, there was indulgence. Instead of moral tyranny, there was aesthetic tyranny. What mattered was not virtue, but style. For the privileged, it was an age of spectacle. For those on the margins, especially women whose value was defined by proximity to powerful men, it was a gilded cage. And at its heart stood Charles, witty, charismatic, and untroubled by contradiction. But not all trials of royal power were hidden behind silk curtains. In 1685, justice would wear robes, not lace, and serve not pleasure, but revenge. All under the command of a new king and a judge whose name would echo like a threat through generations. 42. The Bloody Assizes as royal revenge. In 1685, England crowned a new king, James II, the last Catholic monarch in the country's history, and a man who ascended to power not by charisma or conquest, but by default. His older brother, Charles II, had died without legitimate heirs, though not for lack of trying, and so the crown passed to James, a man viewed with suspicion by many, admired by few, and feared by those who understood how brittle the balance of English politics had become. He didn't wait long to demonstrate why. Just months into his reign, a rebellion broke out in the West Country. James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, Charles II's illegitimate son, landed in Dorset claiming the throne. Protestant, dashing, and popular among some segments of the population, Monmouth painted himself as a liberator sent to rescue the nation from Catholic tyranny. The rebellion was underfunded, poorly armed, and militarily outmatched. But symbolically, it struck a nerve. Monmouth's forces were crushed at the Battle of Sedgemoor. He was captured, denied mercy, and executed. But the violence didn't end there. It had only just begun. What followed was the Bloody Assizes, a series of legal proceedings designed not for justice, but for vengeance. Overseen by Lord Chief Justice George Jeffreys, a man who would become synonymous with cruelty cloaked in legality, the assizes toured the West Country with the solemnity of a royal procession and the speed of a traveling storm. Over 1,000 people were tried. The charges ranged from rebellion to association, sometimes as vague as having offered food to a rebel. The punishments were harsh and theatrical. Executions, imprisonments, transportation to the colonies. Entire families were ruined. Property was seized. Local communities were left shattered. And through it all, Jeffries performed like a man auditioning for history, mocking defendants, shouting down appeals, and delivering sentences with a flourish that bordered on performance art. He wore the law like a mask, but everyone could see the intent beneath it. James II didn't publicly micromanage the assizes, but few doubted they reflected his approval. He wanted a message sent. Rebellion would not be tolerated, and loyalty to the crown would not be optional. It was rule through fear, delivered by gavel instead of sword, and made palatable by calling it justice. But repression rarely ends where it starts. The bloody assizes sparked national unease. Even among those who supported James's right to rule, the spectacle of mass punishment, carried out with such theatrical cruelty, stirred discomfort. The monarchy was supposed to protect its people, not purge them. Jeffries would later die imprisoned in the Tower of London after James's regime collapsed during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But by then, the damage was done. The assizes had written a warning into the nation's memory. Sometimes the law is just a velvet glove around a clenched fist. And just when the people thought the court couldn't become more paranoid, the Queen gave birth, and half the country claimed the baby wasn't hers. Because in royal politics, even a newborn can trigger a constitutional crisis. 43. A queen consort's secret Catholicism and political panic. Mary of Modena didn't plan to become the face of a constitutional crisis. She was young, devout, elegant, and largely apolitical. But when she married James, Duke of York, in 1673, her private faith would one day ignite a very public panic. She was Catholic. Quietly, sincerely, and unwaveringly Catholic. In the climate of Restoration England, that detail was not just inconvenient, it was combustible. At the time of their marriage, her husband was still heir presumptive to Charles II, and though his own Catholicism was a poorly kept secret, it had not yet triggered open revolt. England was officially Protestant, but compromise still hung uneasily in the air like leftover incense. The marriage was arranged in part to build diplomatic bridges with Catholic powers in Europe. The problem was, no one in England actually wanted the bridge, least of all the Parliament. Mary's presence at court made the religious tensions feel personal. She wasn't just Catholic, she was foreign, Italian, and cloaked in the soft opulence of continental piety. Her household included priests, chaplains, and Catholic advisors. She worshipped in private chapels, received Catholic visitors, and raised eyebrows without ever raising her voice. To her critics, it wasn't what she did, it was what she represented. The possibility that England could be dragged backward toward the rituals and hierarchies it had violently broken from a century before. When James became king in 1685, the unease turned electric. Mary was now Queen of England, a Catholic queen in a Protestant kingdom, married to a Catholic king, raising the possibility of a Catholic heir. Still, many hoped the issue might resolve itself. James was aging. Mary had suffered multiple miscarriages. Their only surviving children were daughters, Anne and Mary, from James's previous Protestant marriage. So even if the current monarch was Catholic, the future looked safely Anglican. Until it didn't. In 1688, after years of reproductive tragedy and failed pregnancies, Mary gave birth to a healthy son, James Francis Edward Stuart, a male heir, Catholic. And suddenly, everything changed. Instead of joy, the birth was met with disbelief and conspiracy. Within hours, rumors spread that the child wasn't hers. The story went that Mary had never been pregnant at all, that the real baby had died, that a random child had been smuggled into the Queen's bedchamber in a warming pan, a secret substitution to fake a royal heir. Witnesses were questioned. Servants were scrutinized. Pamphlets exploded with speculation. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered was what people were willing to believe. The warming pan scandal wasn't just tabloid gossip. It became political dynamite. Protestants who had once tolerated James now saw confirmation of their worst fears. A Catholic dynasty had been planted, quite literally, in the cradle. And, if the monarchy could be manipulated that easily, what else might be happening behind velvet curtains? It didn't take long for the fallout to come. Within months, James would flee the country, the glorious revolution would unfold, and Mary's child would grow up in exile, still believing he was the rightful king. But before that next chapter begins, the question remains, how does a single birth, real or imagined, upend the monarchy? Simple, because in England, every royal baby is born not just into a family, but into a battle for the soul of the state. 44. The warming pan baby scandal. It should have been a moment of joy. On June 10, 1688, Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, after years of miscarriages, stillbirths, and failed hopes. For King James II, the arrival of a healthy male heir was not only a personal triumph, but a political one. A Catholic dynasty was now not just present, but future-proofed. The House of Stuart would continue, not through Protestant daughters, but through a legitimate Catholic prince. And that was precisely the problem. England, by then, was already on edge. James II's reign had unsettled Parliament, the Church, and the broader public. His open Catholicism, his appointments of Catholics to high office, and his repeated dismissals of parliamentary authority had eroded trust. The birth of a son didn't soothe that distrust. It crystallized it. Almost immediately, the rumor mill ignited. The Queen, it was claimed, had not been pregnant at all. The real child, stillborn or non-existent, had been replaced. According to the story, during the carefully managed royal birth, a substitute baby had been smuggled into the bedchamber in a warming pan, a device used to heat beds in cold weather. The midwives and attendants were in on it. The candles had been dimmed, the witnesses had been hand-picked, and now the kingdom was being asked to accept a fraud as its future king. It sounds ludicrous, because it was. Yet the timing, the secrecy, and the public's readiness to believe the worst made the fiction powerful. Royal births were usually semi-public affairs, with key witnesses present to verify the legitimacy of succession. In this case, most of those witnesses were Catholic allies or foreign dignitaries. Protestant courtiers, influential nobles, and political skeptics were conspicuously absent. That absence became fertile ground for doubt. Political pamphlets fanned the flames. Caricatures appeared in coffeehouses. Foreign ambassadors, foreign, reported the gossip with a mixture of amusement and alarm. Queen Mary, recovering from childbirth, found herself the target of a nationwide whisper campaign. Even letters from the palace couldn't stamp out the rumors, because no amount of official denial could compete with the power of a story that explained what so many people already feared, that the king was engineering a Catholic future behind a curtain of incense and velvet. The scandal wasn't just domestic. Across Europe, Protestant rulers watched nervously. William of Orange, married to James II's Protestant daughter Mary, had been quietly courted by English nobles who were unwilling to see a Catholic prince raised as heir. The warming pan baby became their rallying cry. A convenient symbol, a moral justification, an invitation for intervention. By the end of that same year, William would land in England with an army. James would flee. Parliament would declare the throne vacant, and the baby born into suspicion would be exiled before he could speak. But he would not be forgotten. His existence, real, royal, and relentlessly contested, would cast a shadow over every monarch that followed. Because in England, once a child becomes a conspiracy theory, the crown itself becomes a question mark. And what followed was not stability, but a new chapter of locked towers, royal cousins, and quiet disappearances. 45. A queen sister dies in the Tower. Arabella Stuart never tried to be a threat. If anything, she tried to be the opposite, quiet, cautious, courtly. She read poetry, wrote polite letters, and avoided scandal. But her bloodline, thick with royal entanglements, refused to let her vanish into the background. In the dangerous arithmetic of succession, Arabella was both too close to the throne to ignore and too politically awkward to trust. She was the great-granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. That made her, to those with a keen genealogical eye and a knack for political paranoia, a plausible heir to the English crown. Not first in line, not even second, but close enough to make nervous monarchs twitch, especially when England, after the chaos of the Tudor era and the still fresh fallout of the Glorious Revolution, was allergic to uncertainty. Arabella's life was a slow tightening of restrictions. She was raised under surveillance, shuffled between noble households, and forbidden from marrying without royal consent. That consent, of course, never came, because marriage, especially for someone of royal blood, was never just personal. It was strategic. A spouse meant alliances. Children meant dynastic claims. And Arabella had the one thing most dangerous to possess in a kingdom obsessed with order: the ability to produce a future rival. And so, for years, she waited. Elegant, intelligent, and increasingly isolated. Then came the mistake. Or perhaps the inevitability. In 1610, Arabella secretly married William Seymour, himself a descendant of Edward VI's uncle. A union of two people who, separately, were minor threats. Together, they became a hypothetical crisis. If they had children, those children would have a powerful claim, one that could rally factions discontent with King James I, especially those still sour over his Scottish roots. The response was swift and unsurprising. Arabella and William were arrested. William was sent to the Tower of London. Arabella, initially held elsewhere, pleaded for leniency. She wrote desperate letters to the king, insisting her marriage was a private matter, not a political scheme. She even expressed willingness to annul it, but James, ever cautious and not particularly sentimental, refused. Eventually, Arabella was also confined to the Tower. She attempted escape, disguised, desperate, romantic in a tragic sort of way. William did manage to flee. Arabella did not. She was recaptured, returned to the Tower, and left to fade into institutional silence. Over time, her mental health deteriorated. The court stopped paying attention. She became one of those political problems that solved itself through slow neglect. In 1615, Arabella Stuart died in the Tower. Alone, uncrowned, unburied for days. Her death didn't spark an outcry. It didn't provoke a rebellion. It didn't even get a proper scandal. But it did leave a lingering question. What does it mean to be born royal in a system that treats your very existence as treason? Arabella's story is often overshadowed by the more dramatic fates of queens and rebels. But hers may be the most quietly devastating of all. A life undone not by ambition, but by the refusal to be erased. And in the next royal tragedy, that erasure wouldn't just be social. It would extend even to the physical body, hidden away and managed like a classified document. 46. A queen's body used as a political secret. In life, Queen Caroline of Ansbach was clever, composed, and unusually well-informed for a royal consort. In death, she became a riddle of silence, ceremony, and concealed suffering. The story of her final days is less about one woman's illness than about the curious way monarchy transforms the human body into state property, and the strange choreography of secrecy that follows when that body begins to fail. Caroline was married to George II, the first monarch in British history to be born in Britain after the Glorious Revolution. Their marriage, while politically arranged, was unusually stable by Hanoverian standards, meaning neither of them ran off with a mistress or staged a public screaming match in Parliament. Caroline played the expected role: supportive consort, reliable producer of heirs, and quiet operator in the background of policy. But she also had a sharp mind and a subtle influence, particularly during her husband's frequent absences from court. By the 1730s, however, Caroline's health began to decline. The official story was vague: fatigue, some pain, perhaps stress. But behind the silks and state portraits, she was struggling with a severe and worsening condition, most likely an umbilical hernia, worsened over years and left untreated far too long. The reality was painful, debilitating, and eventually fatal. But royal illness was not merely a medical matter. It was a political variable, and as such, it had to be managed. The Queen's suffering was shielded from public view. Only a small circle of physicians and courtiers knew the truth, and even they offered conflicting accounts. Letters from the time hint at long nights, hushed consultations, and a growing sense that no one wanted to say out loud what everyone suspected, that the Queen was dying. George II, known more for bluster than sentiment, surprised many by staying close to Caroline during her decline. He visited regularly, spoke gently to her, even promised not to remarry, though in typical fashion, he added that he would keep mistresses. Of course. It was the kind of half-joke that only a husband-king could make during a deathbed vigil. When Caroline finally died in 1737, the court moved quickly to shape the narrative. The cause of death was generalized, sanitized, and dressed in the language of dignified resignation. There would be no mention of hernia, no discussion of failed surgeries, no admission of the years of pain quietly endured while fulfilling ceremonial duties. Her body was dressed, displayed, and entombed with all the pageantry expected of a queen. But the concealment spoke volumes. Monarchs weren't allowed to die from ordinary afflictions. Their deaths, like their lives, had to be wrapped in symbolism. The crown couldn't afford to look vulnerable, especially not through the body of a woman who had so often held the emotional center of the court. Caroline's decline revealed an unsettling truth, that even queens could vanish behind the curtain of royal necessity, that illness could be edited, that suffering could be folded into the choreography of legacy. And in the next story, it wouldn't just be secrecy that defined a royal wife's fate. It would be erasure on an entirely different scale. No slow goodbye, no state vigil, just a quiet disappearance and a locked door that stayed closed for decades. 47. A king's wife erased, lifelong imprisonment. Sophia Dorothea of Celle was once a princess, not a fairy tale one. No glass slippers, no enchanted ballroom, but the daughter of a German duke with a respectable dowry, and more importantly, the kind of lineage that made her useful. That was enough. At 16, she was married off to her cousin, George Ludwig of Hanover. The marriage was political, cold, and as it turned out, quietly catastrophic. George was not charming. He was not affectionate. He was not even consistently present. Their union produced 2 children, including the future George II, but little else in the way of affection. George spent much of his time with his longtime mistress, while Sophia found companionship, emotional, perhaps romantic, with a man named Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck, a Swedish noble. Whatever passed between them, letters, conversations, possibly more, was enough to trigger alarm. The Hanoverian court was already tense. George's father, the Elector of Hanover, had ambitions for the English throne. Scandal, especially of the romantic variety, was a liability. Königsmarck soon vanished, likely murdered, though his body was never found. Sophia was interrogated, humiliated, and ultimately declared unfit to remain at court. And so, in 1694, at just 28 years old, Sophia Dorothea was locked away in the castle of Alden in northern Germany. She would never leave. Her imprisonment wasn't framed as punishment. Officially, she had agreed to a separation. There was no trial, no formal sentence. She was simply removed. From the palace, from public life, from memory. Her name was struck from prayers. Her correspondence was censored. She was not allowed to see her children. Even when her father died, she was denied permission to attend the funeral. The walls were not just physical. They were bureaucratic, diplomatic, absolute. Over the years, Sophia's presence became a quiet problem that needed no solving. She had no title, no court, no visitors beyond what was required for minimal civility. She lived effectively as a ghost, alive but erased. Meanwhile, her estranged husband became King George III of Great Britain in 1714. He crossed the Channel, claimed the throne, and ruled England while his former wife sat in a damp castle in rural Germany, still forbidden from returning or speaking publicly. She died there in 1726, after 32 years of isolation. No grand funeral, no royal mourning. Just a quiet death, followed by a carefully managed absence from the record books. Sophia Dorothea was buried in Chell, not beside her husband, not even recognized in England for generations. Her existence had been too dangerous, too complicated, too unhelpful. It's a reminder that monarchy, for all its pomp and drama, often defines its legacy not by who it remembers, but by who it decides to forget. But while Sophia was locked away for decades, her fate was at least known. The next royal story would twist in a more unpredictable direction, where the king's condition wasn't hidden in exile, but buried under layers of secrecy, confusion, and whispered fears of madness at the very heart of the palace. 48. The hidden madness of George III. George III is remembered by most as the king who lost America. That's the neat, digestible version. Less discussed, but far more unsettling, is the fact that for long stretches of his reign, the king was not fully present. Not in the political sense, in the personal, mental, and profoundly destabilizing sense. Because George III didn't just lose colonies, he lost himself. The first signs came in 1788. The king, by then nearly 3 decades into his reign, was behaving erratically. He spoke in torrents, as if thought and speech were disconnected. He grew paranoid. His speech patterns altered. His letters became incoherent. His attendants were alarmed. So were his ministers. And his family, well, they were placed in the awkward position of having to decide whether the monarch could still be treated as monarch or needed to be treated, period. Today, historians and medical experts debate the diagnosis. At the time, at the ease, physicians flailed. Some blamed melancholy. Others suspected nervous fever. Modern research has proposed porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder, as a possible cause, though recent scholarship leans increasingly toward a form of bipolar disorder or another mental health condition. What is not debated is the effect. The 1788 crisis was so severe that Parliament debated installing a regency under the king's son, the future George IV. But before the measure could be passed, George III recovered. Or at least, seemed to. His speech returned to normal. His behavior stabilized. He resumed his duties, and the political machinery pretended nothing had happened. But the memory of that winter lingered. The king had become a man who could vanish into himself without warning. And the court responded not with openness, but with an ever-deepening strategy of containment. His second major episode came in 1801. Again the symptoms returned. Again, they were managed in silence. Treatments were primitive and, by today's standards, cruel. Isolation, restraint, medical interventions that prioritize control over care. Details are fragmentary, partly because the doctor's notes were destroyed or suppressed, and partly because the royal household went to great lengths to ensure that what happened in the palace stayed in the palace. By 1810, the king's condition had deteriorated beyond repair. Following the death of his favorite daughter, Princess Amelia, his mental state collapsed completely. Parliament enacted the Regency Act, and his son officially took over as Prince Regent. George III remained king in name only. For the next 10 years, he lived in seclusion at Windsor Castle, blind, often incoherent, and completely removed from public life. And yet, officially, he was still king. The contradiction was papered over by ceremony. The monarchy kept its public face polished while its actual sovereign lived behind locked doors, surrounded by silence and carefully curated distance. For the court, the strategy was clear: preserve the institution, even if the individual within it is unraveling. George III died in 1820, having spent the last decade of his reign as a monarch in shadow. But the legacy of his hidden decline raised an enduring question. What happens when the sovereign's body is present, but the mind is not? And in the next royal secret, that tension would reappear, not in the palace but in private letters, hidden marriages, and a love story so politically dangerous it had to be disbelieved by law. 49. A secret Catholic marriage the state wouldn't recognize. In 1785, George, Prince of Wales, future George IV, did something astonishingly unwise, deeply heartfelt, and entirely illegal. He got married, not to a foreign princess in a dynastic alliance, not with Parliament's blessing, not even with the king's grudging approval. He married for love. And worse, he married a Catholic. Maria Fitzherbert was twice widowed, devoutly Roman Catholic, and thoroughly inappropriate by royal standards. She had no crown, no throne, no political utility. What she had, however, was the unwavering affection of the heir to the British throne. Their relationship had simmered for years before George, ever impulsive and forever in debt, proposed in secret. And she, despite knowing full well that the union would be invalid under British law, accepted. The marriage took place quietly, without official sanction, and in clear violation of the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required the king's permission for any royal descendant to wed. Add to that Maria's religion, and the legal, political, and constitutional stakes were suddenly staggering. If the marriage were acknowledged, George would be disqualified from the line of succession under the laws excluding Catholics from the throne. And if it were denied, it raised a different problem. What exactly had just happened? The Crown's strategy was to pretend it hadn't happened at all. There was no public record, no announcement, no official acknowledgement. Maria Fitzherbert was kept at the margins, respected by some, whispered about by many, and absolutely forbidden to step into any formal role. For his part, George oscillated between obsession and political calculation. He referred to her as his wife in private, lavished her with gifts, and maintained a lifelong emotional connection, even as he later entered an official marriage with Princess Caroline of Brunswick. But that later marriage, conducted with all the trappings of royal protocol, was a disaster. George and Caroline disliked each other on sight. Their union produced a single heir, Princess Charlotte, and then collapsed into public acrimony. Meanwhile, Maria remained a kind of ghost wife, appearing in the background, legally invisible but emotionally indelible. When George ascended the throne in 1820, the question resurfaced. Had he ever truly been married to Maria Fitzherbert? And if so, what did that mean for the legitimacy of his reign? Maria, for her part, kept her silence, until after his death. In her will, and through select disclosures, she revealed the documents proving the 1785 ceremony. The marriage had indeed taken place. But by then, it was too late to matter. Legally, the Crown never recognized the union. Politically, it was treated as an indiscretion. Personally, it was something closer to a wound that never quite healed. George referred to Maria on his deathbed. He asked for her portrait to be buried with him, and she, ever careful, never sought public acknowledgement, only the dignity of having mattered. Their story remains an uncomfortable footnote in royal history, a reminder that love, when paired with law, can become an unresolvable paradox. And in the next chapter, love won't just be inconvenient. It will come with a price tag so large, Parliament had to pick up the bill. 50. Regency excess and crushing debt, paid by the state. If monarchy is performance, then George IV was its most theatrical lead. Before he ever wore a crown, he wore everything else. Brocade jackets, powdered wigs, velvet slippers, diamond-studded snuff boxes. His wardrobe alone could have filled a palace, and often did. As Prince of Wales, then as Prince Regent, and finally as King, George IV turned royal extravagance into an Olympic sport. His personal motto might as well have been, "Spend first, avoid Parliament later. Born into wealth and raised with the assurance that he would one day rule a vast empire, George understood two things very well. Appearances were everything, and someone else would always pay. The trouble was, the someone else usually ended up being the British taxpayer. By his 20s, George had already racked up staggering debts, lavish banquets, horse racing, private theaters, gambling, mistresses, custom furniture, and imported silks, all funded with borrowed money and creative accounting. His architectural tastes leaned toward the mythologically absurd. At Carlton House, he commissioned ceilings adorned with gold-leaf cherubs and walls lined with classical friezes. Then there was the Brighton Pavilion, a seaside fantasy that looked like an Indian palace crashed into a Chinese tea house, rebuilt in Regency style, and filled with chandeliers the size of small boats. It was beautiful. It was bizarre. It was unspeakably expensive. By 1795, the prince's debts exceeded £600,000, roughly $80 million today, adjusted for inflation. The solution? A bailout. Parliament, reluctant but cornered, agreed to cover much of the cost in exchange for George marrying a suitable Protestant princess. Enter Princess Caroline of Brunswick, who turned out to be wildly incompatible with her new husband. The marriage lasted barely long enough to produce an heir. The debts, however, continued. This cycle repeated itself. George would spend beyond his means, the government would grumble, negotiations would follow, and eventually another public bailout would be arranged. Parliament wasn't exactly eager to subsidize his taste for gold-embroidered everything, but the logic went something like this. Better to indulge a prince than risk embarrassing the monarchy. Financial discretion, after all, was not yet a royal virtue. Even as George aged, his appetite for grandeur never faded. When he finally became king in 1820, coronation plans ballooned into a spectacle of mythic proportions. Costumes were designed to evoke Arthurian legend. A crown was remade to include nearly 13,000 jewels. The bill? Nearly £250,000 for the ceremony alone. This at a time when much of the country was grappling with poverty, unrest, and the long aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. But here's the twist. Despite his excesses, George IV helped define the modern image of royalty. The pageantry, the palaces, the public ceremonial role, all polished under his watch, albeit at immense cost. He made monarchy into a lifestyle brand before the term existed. Still, every crown has its receipts. And in the shadows of George's lavish displays lay the uneasy truth. When kings live like gods, someone else is left cleaning up the ledger. In the next story, that price wouldn't just be financial. It would be genetic. A single mutation would enter the bloodline, passed in silence, destined to haunt royal houses across continents. 51. The royal disease. Hemophilia enters the dynasty. If there's one thing monarchies care about more than power, it's lineage. Bloodlines are their foundation, their brand, their claim to divine or constitutional right. But what happens when that blood turns against them? In the case of Queen Victoria, it started quietly. A medical footnote that would soon ripple across generations. When her son, Prince Leopold, began showing troubling symptoms, bruises that lingered, wounds that wouldn't heal, doctors realized this wasn't a common ailment. It was hemophilia, a genetic condition that prevents blood from clotting properly. Dangerous for anyone. Catastrophic in a royal family obsessed with continuity and control. Victoria herself was a carrier. Though unaffected, she passed the mutation down through her descendants. Through her, the disease spread like a quiet thread across the tapestry of European royalty. 3 of her 9 children inherited the gene, and through strategic intermarriages, intended to strengthen dynastic alliances, it found its way into the royal houses of Spain, Prussia, and most famously, Russia. Victoria's daughters, Alice and Beatrice, unknowingly carried the mutation to their own children. Alice's daughter, Alexandra, would later become Empress of Russia and pass hemophilia to her son, Tsarevich Alexei. His condition would spark desperation at the Russian court and invite the influence of Rasputin, a mystic whose presence would destabilize the Romanovs' already shaky hold on power. One mutated gene helped drag down an empire. But let's go back to Britain. Within Victoria's own court, hemophilia was treated like a secret shame. Prince Leopold, despite his intelligence and charm, lived under careful restrictions. No rough play, no contact sports, constant medical supervision. His life was shadowed by caution. He was bright, cultured, and painfully aware of his physical limitations. The court didn't publicly acknowledge his condition. To admit vulnerability, especially one that could be passed on, was to risk the perception of dynastic weakness. And weakness, in royal terms, was never just personal. It was political. Behind the scenes, palace doctors and advisors scrambled to manage the unmanageable. Medical science at the time had little to offer. No reliable treatment, no cure, just bloodletting, superstition, and risk management. Publicly, the royal family projected stability. Privately, they adjusted to a new and invisible threat coursing through their lineage. The irony? Victoria was often called the grandmother of Europe. Her children married into nearly every major royal house on the continent. The idea was to forge peace through blood ties. Instead, she inadvertently seeded a hereditary illness that would haunt her descendants for over a century. Hemophilia became known as the royal disease because of her, not because it was exclusive to royalty, but because royalty had no way to hide it forever. It was a quiet mutation with loud consequences, and it made one thing painfully clear. Even in palaces of gold and stone, blood tells its own stories. In the next chapter, that story becomes personal, when Queen Victoria's own son, the charming but frail Prince Leopold, must live with the reality of royal life under constant threat from within his own veins. 52. A hemophiliac prince and the costs of inheritance. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, was born in 1853 as the 8th child and youngest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. At first glance, he appeared no different from his royal siblings, another addition to the ever-expanding web of the House of Hanover. But within months, it became clear that Leopold was not like the others. Behind the nursery doors of Buckingham Palace, a quiet pattern began to emerge. Small injuries that wouldn't heal, bruises from minor bumps, alarming reactions to everyday childhood misadventures. Something was wrong with the prince's blood. By the time he was a toddler, court physicians had diagnosed him with what would come to be known as hemophilia, though at the time, the science of it was rudimentary at best. The language of bad blood still clung to superstition. All they knew was that the slightest fall could result in days of agony. The wrong cut could be fatal. And the heir to one of the most powerful dynasties in the world would have to be protected from everything. The consequences were immediate and lifelong. Leopold was denied the rough-and-tumble privileges of boyhood. No horseback riding, no tree climbing, no fencing lessons with his brothers. He lived under constant surveillance, trailed by attendants who acted as both guardians and jailers. Freedom, spontaneity, and physicality were all hazards. His childhood was not so much royal as it was restricted. But he was smart. Exceptionally so. Barred from sports, Leopold turned to books. He read voraciously, argued passionately, and took a strong interest in philosophy, politics, and art. At Oxford, he earned respect for his intellect and wit. He was described by those who knew him as thoughtful, generous, and surprisingly modern in his thinking, more liberal than his mother, and more curious than most of his peers. But no amount of intellect could change the physical reality of his condition. Victoria, deeply attached to her youngest son, was also painfully aware of the danger he represented, not just to himself, but to the image of the crown. A royal who could bleed to death from a bruise was a vulnerability the monarchy didn't know how to explain. Thus, Leopold's condition was carefully managed in public and obsessively controlled in private. Royal correspondences and biographies of the time mention his delicacy, his fragile health, but seldom use the word itself, hemophilia. It was treated as both an affliction and a political liability. Despite, or perhaps because of, his constraints, Leopold pushed back. He requested a meaningful role in the royal apparatus, advocated for disabled individuals in British society, and lobbied to live with as much independence as his body would allow. He married a German princess, Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont, and fathered 2 children. But his condition loomed over every chapter of his life. In 1884, while traveling in the south of France to escape the damp English winter, Leopold slipped and fell. The injury was not particularly dramatic, just a simple fall, but that was all it took. He died soon after, at the age of 30. His daughter, Princess Alice of Albany, would become the first woman in the British royal family known to carry the hemophilia gene. The disease, now undeniably embedded in the bloodline, continued its quiet journey through generations. The implications were vast, not only for the British monarchy, but for Europe at large, where royal matchmaking spread the gene into half a dozen other houses. Prince Leopold's short life stands as a case study in what happens when the idea of royal perfection collides with biological truth. His story is tender, tragic, and politically volatile, not because he failed, but because he reminded the court of something it could not sanitize, that even under crowns, skin breaks, and blood flows. But the next prince wouldn't even be given the opportunity to be remembered that way. Because in the 20th century, when royalty faced imperfection, the strategy evolved. It wasn't restriction or secrecy, it was removal. The next royal child wouldn't be overprotected, he would be hidden entirely. 53. A child prince hidden away to protect the brand. Prince John of the United Kingdom was born on July 12, 1905, the 5th son and youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary. His birth was met with the usual fanfare, an announcement, public cheers, a few lines in the newspapers celebrating the continuation of the royal line. But unlike his older siblings, Prince John would not grow up to perform ceremonial duties, travel the empire, or wave from palace balconies. Instead, he would vanish gradually from the public eye until most people forgot he existed at all. The reason? Illness. From early childhood, John suffered from seizures and developmental challenges. Doctors today believe he likely had a form of epilepsy, possibly combined with other neurological conditions. At the time, however, there was no precise diagnosis. Just a growing sense within the royal household that John was not like his siblings. As he grew older, his condition became harder to ignore. His behavior was unpredictable. He struggled with learning, and his seizures became more frequent. In a different family, this might have elicited compassion, open caregiving, or at least a private effort to understand. But this was the British royal family in the early 20th century. An institution built on tradition, control, and above all, appearance. There was no room in the royal image for a child who did not fit the mold. So the strategy was subtle and quiet. Remove him. First, he stopped appearing in official portraits. Then he was increasingly left out of public events. Eventually, he was moved away entirely, relocated to Wood Farm, a secluded house on the Sandringham estate. There he lived with a small team of caretakers, a nurse named Lala Bill, and limited contact with the rest of his family. His name was seldom mentioned in public. His condition, even more rarely. This wasn't cruelty in the classic sense. John was not mistreated. Those who cared for him, especially his nurse, were reportedly devoted and loving. He enjoyed time in the garden, played with animals, rode in a pony cart. In many ways, he had a peaceful existence, far from the pressures of court life. But it was also a life lived in deliberate isolation, from his siblings, from the press, and from the national narrative of who the royal family was. When Prince John died in January 1919, aged just 13, the palace released a brief statement. He had suffered a fatal seizure in his sleep. The public, having barely known he existed, offered little reaction. Newspapers ran short obituaries. His funeral was private. The most revealing reaction came from Queen Mary, who wrote that, "For John, it is a great release." That phrase, well-intentioned or not, captures the tone of the entire episode. In royal terms, imperfection was a burden best kept out of view, and its end was seen as a quiet resolution. Only decades later did the public begin to learn more. Through biographies, archival research, and dramatizations, Prince John's story slowly resurfaced, not as scandal but as a quiet moral indictment of the institution's priorities. His life was not erased with malice, but managed with a brand manager's cold logic. If something does not serve the crown's image, it does not belong in the picture. Today, some interpret his seclusion as protective, a way to shield him from public misunderstanding, from press intrusion, from ridicule. Others see it as erasure. Either way, the result was the same. A royal child who lived and died largely invisible to the country he was born to serve in name. And with his passing, we close this long chain of hidden corners, locked doors, and royal shadows. 53 stories, each revealing something the history books never quite wanted to teach. That the British monarchy, for all its ceremony and spectacle, has often maintained its power not just through blood, but through silence. Silence about those who were removed, who disappeared, who bled, who were married in secret, who died in castles no one was allowed to visit. And if we're being honest, it's what makes the crown shine so brightly, the darkness it's built to conceal.